that ends up beneficial to the greater good is such an important point that ends up being lost. And this kind of ties together all the ideas of passion, intrinsic motivation, work ethic, being good at something, and exploring that to your potential. Why we have such a negative connotation to this idea of Islam or the Muslim faith.
Well, I think we have a negative connotation first and foremostly because Muslims suck. I'm just going to lay it out there. I have a very low level of admiration for, speaking in broad blanket terms, the Muslim world today. There is a moment of reckoning that is very fast approaching for the Muslim world. It is due penalty, I would say, for being so callous and careless about this gift that they've been given, this religion. So who is this character then, this Decoy? I believe it's Trump. Why do I believe it's Trump? Because the pattern recognition makes me see it as being Trump. Just the way his first presidency, his stolen presidency, and now his second presidency, just the way it's played out is very similar to the story of Christ, He's had his second coming.
Welcome to the first episode of the Competent Man podcast. I'm your host, Tom Bodrix, and I really appreciate you checking it out. My guest today is Faisal Huda. Faisal holds a bachelor's in applied science in chemical engineering from the University of Waterloo and also an MBA from HEC France and is now retired. Faisal very much embodies the idea of a competent man as he's truly an autodidact, learning things like PineScript in his spare time, reading widely, and also tinkering on classic cars. You can find him on Twitter @BunaCapital and his full bio in the description. If you find value in today's discussion, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, as this will help me to bring you more wide-ranging discussions like this one. Enjoy.
All right, Faisal, welcome to the Competent Man. Thanks for joining me for the first episode.
Thanks for having me. I'm flattered to be the first episode.
I'm actually really honored to A, to call you a friend, and B, to be able to have this conversation with you. But I think a good place to kind of start today's conversation is to talk a little bit about what the impetus and what the goal of this podcast is going to be. One of my favorite quotes is by Robert A. Heinlein, and it says, "A human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, con a ship, design a building, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, set a bone, comfort the dying, take orders, give orders, cooperate, act alone, solve equations, analyze a new problem, pitch manure, program a computer, cook a tasty meal, fight efficiently, die gallantly. Specialization is for insects."
Specialization is for insects.
Absolutely.
Okay, interesting. I haven't heard quite that one before, but that's a good quote.
So this idea of being a true, there's many different names for it. A true Renaissance man, an autodidact, somebody that has the ability to apply a problem-solving framework and or a framework of being able to learn across any discipline is really what I want to be capturing here.
Right, okay.
So you have, through your life, have applied yourself over many different disciplines. And what I would like to start by asking you, and it's funny, you and I have had conversations about starting this podcast. Yeah. It's taken a while to kind of fully materialize and come up with what my stated goal, let's say, of this podcast is going to be. Mm-hmm. And I thought of the first question that I wanted to ask you, and I told you this a while ago, but I never told you the question. So what does fulfill your potential mean to you?
Okay, so first of all, I think the project's exciting and super interesting, and that's why I'm happy to be here and have this conversation with you. And yeah, so through our previous conversations, you've heard from me that my mantra is fulfill your potential, because as I was raised, although it wasn't articulated in precisely those three words, that's how I came to understand it, to understand the meaning of what I was being taught, whether it was by my dad or by my mom. It was to, first of all, discover what God-given talents you've been granted by being put on this earth, and once you discover them, make the best of those talents, exploit those talents and those passions and that acumen to the fullest, not necessarily to benefit yourself, not to benefit oneself, although benefiting yourself should be part of the story, but to exploit those potentials in such a way that you leave the world at least a slightly better place than as you found it. So that opens up a whole slew of different topics we could discuss. But really, what it boiled down to, and I really only crystallized this idea in my mind of fulfill your potential after my dad passed away, after I started reflecting on what was that relationship. So when he passed away, I would have been, so was that 2008? I would have been 34. So what was that 34-year relationship all about? And what I took from it all was that he was trying to teach me essentially the meaning of life, which was to fulfill your potential. Now that quote that you read off at the outset of this conversation, I don't think I could tick off all of those boxes exactly, but I've got my own set of boxes that I can tick off. I studied engineering. That's my formal education in undergrad. I've studied business as well. I've run a business. I've exited a business. First having to turn around the business from a story of failure to a story of success. I've invented stuff. I've got my name on a series of patents. I know how to iron my own shirt. I know how to cook my own meal. Those are like my mom's contributions. Like, if you're going to be a man, you're going to be a self-sufficient man. I'm not going to let you grow up to be somebody who just needs a woman in his life and uses a woman to fill out the half of his existence that he can't manage on his own. So I'm actually, a pretty good cook. I can keep a pretty well-pressed shirt, and I can clean up after myself and organize and do all those tiny little things. Growing up with my dad, growing up in the household, my dad made sure I had a whole series of chores that were my responsibility. We used to heat our house in the winter with wood, so I would haul wood. We lived on a lake, Lake Ontario, growing up, so what would you call it? I guess driftwood would wash in. So hauling wood up from the lake, drying it, cutting it, chopping it, stacking it, hauling it into the house, lighting the fire, tending the fire, all that type of stuff, tinkering on the car with my dad. We didn't grow up with a lot of money, so there was a lot of DIY stuff in the house. So learning that type of stuff from a very young age. Not that he was super proficient at it, but the idea was, solve problems by yourself, figure out what tools you need and how you can, or with the tools that you have on hand, fix the problems that you're encountering. So that mindset has really been inculcated into me since a very young age. And taking that forward then once I left home and embarked out on my own, I guess part of that type of upbringing, what it breeds in a person, or a person who's willing to take in those lessons, is a natural intellectual curiosity for your world and for life. And so I took that mindset with me, intellectual curiosity, when I left home to go off and pursue my undergrad and whatever, and become a man, I guess. And so that's where you use the terminology autodidact, which essentially means self-taught, a person who exposes himself to different subjects and figures it out on his own, teaches himself. And I think it all stems from the intellectual curiosity. So, fulfill your potential. I mean, it's only 3 small words, but it means a whole crap load. And if I were to summarize it all in one, all at once, I would say it's just the meaning of life. You know, so I don't think I ever shared this with you, but when I talk to younger people, I like to find bright minds and energetic young kids that, you know, could use a little bit of shaping and guidance and, yeah, you know, and help unleash their own intellectual curiosities. So the first place I always start with these conversations with younger people is there are 3 fundamental questions that we each as individuals need to ask ourselves, ought to ask ourselves, really. And I don't think there's any one right answer. If you asked yourself the 3 questions, the 3 answers that you'd come up with for yourself would likely be different than the 3 answers I come up with, and that's fine. And those 3 answers might change over the course of your lifetime as well, which is equally fine. And so what those 3 questions are is, what do you think it means to be born, to have been born? You're here. What did that mean? What does it then mean once you were born to then be alive? What does it mean to be alive? And then ultimately, what does it mean to die? And I think, because we all will die, I think if you start turning the wheels in your head and trying to process that, and I don't think there's an instantaneous answer that comes forward either. In other words, it's food for thought, right? Over the course of your entire life. Why was I put here? Now that I'm here, what is it all about? And if I have to die at some point, what's the meaning of that, and how does that relate to my existence here and now? So, you know, as I try and answer that question for myself, the fulfill your potential idea comes into play. So that's how it fits into the bigger picture for me.
So when you, obviously this is a gigantic question to kind of tackle, but when you think about the meaning of life, the meaning of your life, part of that is following your passions, right?
Yeah. Although I probably sacrificed a bunch of passions as well in the course of getting to where I am today. But I'll let you finish the question.
Where I wanted to go with that thought is that, you know, for myself, if I can identify one theme in my life that has, let's say, brought me success, it would have been to always be following something that was intrinsically motivating to me. How do you think you identify directions in your life that are that give you the required energy to be passionate and successful within those particular fields?
So this is a really interesting subject that you raise, because I would say my life story, so if you ask the younger me, well, how old was I at the time? 13 or 14, I think. What do you want to be when you grow up? I would have said a concert violinist, right? Because I had a passion for the violin starting from, what was it, grade 6, however old you are in grade 6, I can't remember, 11, 10, something like that. And I used to skip recess, skip lunch, so to speak, at school, so I could finish all my homework, so that when I got home at night, I could just play the violin, practice the violin. And I would play like 8-9 hours a day. And so that was my passion, long story short. And I wanted to go to an arts high school, and I wanted to pursue the violin. But then in the background of all of this, you know, we've got my family, my parents, immigrants from India, came to this part of the world to be able to do something better for themselves and for their kids than they could ever hope to accomplish back in India, because of the way opportunity is or was in that part of the world versus in this part of the world at that time. And my dad came over in the mid-60s. And he had started his business, and I was the only son. And the whole idea was, I'm going to start this thing, and I'm building it for you, and you're going to do doubly better than I could ever do as your dad. And so when I announced that one evening, as a 14-year-old kid, I wanted to go to the arts high school and pursue violin. I mean, that was shut down pretty quickly. And I was told, you're going to be, there's this business and whatever, chemical engineering, yada, yada, yada. And so if you look at the yearbook, let's call it, of when I graduated from grade 8 to go to high school, at the back of the book, all the little kids are answering, Johnny, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a fireman, policeman. Even at age 14, that was the limit of imagination. Then you get to little Faisal Huda, and it's, what do you want to be when you grow up? Chemical engineer. I had no clue. I had no clue what chemical engineer meant.
Somebody told that to you.
My dad told that to me, and I repeated that, and it went into the yearbook. And if I looked at it now, I'd just roll my eyes. This is ridiculous for a 14-year-old to say that about themselves. But there was always this overarching sense of responsibility that I carried with me. And while I believe it is actually, you're right, that it is important to find intrinsic motivation by pursuing those things that energize you and can motivate you, like the violin did for me. Maybe that was one of my God-given talents, and maybe that was an avenue of potential that I could fulfill. But I could also discover potential by imposing upon myself the discipline of responsibility, fulfilling, living up to the responsibilities that I was born into. Nothing of my choosing, nothing of my making, but that there was a purpose bigger than myself in this whole family story, my life story. That's the business, get the education you need to get in order to pursue success with this thing once it was mine to take over, that idea, right? And so how I was able to make a success out of it was really imposing the discipline upon myself to pursue and do the things that needed to get done. Like, I hated chemical engineering. I don't even know if I liked engineering, period. Like, it kind of fit my personality. I was a numbers guy, science guy, like to take things apart and put them back together. But I don't know if engineering was really where I belonged. But I did it, and I graduated first class honors, even though I hated every waking moment of that degree. But it's just like, if something is worth doing, which it was in my mind because of my sense of responsibility, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing well, or just don't freaking do it. There's no point. Yeah. So like I said, I was gonna do it because I was gonna be the responsible son, and that was gonna make me proud of who I was. There is no such thing as an unselfish act. I remind myself of that. I remind my wife of that. So I wasn't being a martyr or anything. I agreed, maybe reluctantly, but it was my choice. There is that element of personal responsibility that we tend to forget. I took on that responsibility willingly, and so I was going to do a good job at it. And so I got first class honors with it and whatever, and I graduated with the degree, and I've never used it since. Running a business, you don't need to know all that stuff. You hire people to know all that stuff for you, because business is different than, playing with the molecules. You got to figure out how to buy the molecules to transform them and how to sell the molecules. And it's a whole different skill set than the engineering itself. But where engineering was vitally important for me, I think valuable for me, is that it taught problem-solving skills. Like, I was taught problem-solving skills as a young kid growing up in our household, but this just added on that. It accentuated, amplified that skill set. And I think that's one thing that I'm really good at today, to the extent that it takes a lot to phase me when encountered with a crisis or a problem or whatever. It's like, I've had friends around me remark, it's like, how are you not freaking out right now? Like, this is critical, whatever the problem is at hand. I was like, well, there's no point in wasting any of my energy on emotion on this. Like, we got to solve the freaking problem. So this is like take a deep breath if you need to, but, join me when you're ready and let's just get it done. So yeah, I think problem solving skills is something that can be learned, or sorry, can be taught to a person, but I think one can learn it on their own as well. How exactly, I don't know, but I think that's part of what you're trying to impart on the listening audience here as well. It's like, how do you become competent? How do you learn to solve problems on your own? So I think that's what makes this conversation interesting for me, because we do think along similar lines. And, I hope this conversation and other conversations you end up presenting to the listening audience is able to cultivate that a little bit more in society. Because I think it is kind of lacking. I think we are too well taken care of in our modern economies that we've become complacent, and a lot of us are just on autopilot through life.
And maybe too specialized as well. Not, maybe you aren't too spoiled by modern society, but you're too specialized and you only know how to solve problems in one deep, narrow field.
Yeah, exactly. Really deep knowledge on very, very narrow slice of the pie, so to speak. And I kind of feel like that's partially by design. It's not accidental that that's how we are taught to be, how we are educated to be, because a group of people that rely on extrinsic forces or extrinsic influences to help them get through life, right? Like if you only know this much about anything, you need help on everything else. I mean, that herd of people are going to be a lot easier to manage.
It's interesting to think about the parallels and the parallels and yet the different motivations that you and I both had. As when I was a kid, I loved to take stuff apart, figure out how it worked, understand how things work, why they work the way they do. And so I was told I was going to be an engineer as well. Right. But I didn't have that extrinsic sense of responsibility foisted upon me. Right. I went into engineering. I hated almost every moment of it. I loved the actual design courses, the drafting courses, actually being able to build things. I hated the chemistry part of it. I hated the algebra and the calculus, and all of the external prerequisites. I absolutely hated.
Yeah. It sounded like you liked the creative side of it.
Exactly. I like the problem-solving side of it, and the conceptualization of taking, drawing a part out by hand in the isometric and orthographic views.
Yeah.
I love that part of it, and I love building the things.
Yeah.
But the motivation to sit down and learn chemistry when I wanted nothing to do with chemistry was so frustrating to me. And then kind of finding, in a roundabout way, finding welding as a good paying summer job, that was far more intrinsically motivating to me, and I ended up going off and doing welding. But I think one of the most interesting ways to kind of encapsulate the way that you see life, the way that you approach life and kind of crystallize your mindset is a book that you and I have both read, and that's Atlas Shrugged. So tell me the story about who you have required, or how you came to know that book, and who you've also required through your life to actually read that book.
Right, okay. So growing up, I was never much of a reader of fiction. Like I always liked, nonfiction, science, whatever, history, because I like to learn. But there is value in fiction as well, as I've come to appreciate. So this was even later in my life, I'd say. I was, 27, 28, I guess, at the time, when I was living in France and doing my business degree. And I met a girl and we started dating, and she was an avid reader of fiction, and not nonfiction, actually. and she had a bookshelf that was just stacked with literature. And I pointed to one really extra thick book, and I said, well, why did you, because she was from the US and we were living in France, like I said, why did you haul this all the way across the ocean with you, this big, heavy, because books are heavy, right? Regardless of how thick or thin they are, the more you carry, the more heavy they are. So it made no sense to me. She's like, well, because it's, my all-time favorite book. I'm like, well, what is it? I was pointing at Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And she's like, you've never heard of Ayn Rand, or you've never heard of Atlas Shrugged, something like that. And I was just like a little taken aback and was like slightly embarrassed that, okay, what am I missing here? And she said, well, I'm not going to tell you about it. You're gonna have to read this. You have to read this, she said. So I did. And I've read it twice. Once I read it the normal way, and the second time I listened to it through audiobook to refresh my memory on it. But the reason I fell in love with that book, and why it's probably one of my all-time favorites, if not, probably is my all-time favorite fictional work, is because for me it was really liberating. Through that background story that I told you about with the family business and stuff, I think one of the levers of control that my parents would use to control me was to control the behavior and the outcomes, was to criticize me of not being sufficiently, for being too self-centered, well, in my current lingo, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but they would say, you're being too selfish. It's not just about you, it's about, the community, in this sense, the family. And so I grew up thinking I was, doing the right thing, being responsible, but I was always struggling and fighting against some inner evil in myself of, being too selfish. Lo and behold, you read this book, and Ayn Rand's, one of her fundamental philosophies is the virtue of selfishness. And so this is where we come to the contrast that I have to draw, and why I say it's my own lingo here, because in English, we don't have a word that sufficiently captures the idea of the virtuous side of being selfish. And the example that I use to help people understand very quickly what it means for selfishness to have virtue is, if you can't look after yourself first, if you don't look after yourself first, I should say, you're not going to be in any shape to help anybody else. So imagine on an airplane, plenty of people have flown on airplanes now, and they give you that safety talk at the beginning, seat belts, crash position, whatever. There's that little bit about, if the oxygen masks come down, put your own oxygen mask on first before even thinking of helping anybody around you, little kids, elderly people, whoever they may be. You got to help yourself first, because if you don't have that oxygen and you pass out while trying to, get the mask onto your kid, what good are you to that kid? That kid's going to, asphyxiate as well as you. So, and I hope people understand what I mean by that looking after yourself, making sure you are healthy, making sure that you are happy, making sure that you know what you need to know in order to lead the group, whether it's your family, whether it's just you and your spouse, or whatever the group might be. You are useless to other people unless you have, groomed yourself to be that leader, right? And so there is virtue in selfishness, but typically when we hear the word selfish in the English language in common parlance, we think of it as a criticism. We hear it as a criticism. Oh, you're being selfish. So how do we distinguish between serving yourself at the expense of others, the typical definition of being selfish, versus what Ayn Rand is trying to teach, serving yourself in order that you may be able to serve others? So this is where I said to myself, and I told my wife, when you hear me say the word selfish, I'm talking about a good thing. But if you hear me use the word self-centered, I'm using it in a critical way. You are serving yourself in such a manner that the world revolves around you in your head, right? That you are the center of it all. You're self-centered, and everybody around you is there to serve you. Versus selfishness, as Ayn Rand likes to teach it, that there's virtue in it. And I don't think I'm going to redefine the English language or reshape the English language in any way, but you know, when I speak, when I use the word selfish, I don't mean it the way other people mean it. I will use the word self-centered in that case.
So getting back to that, let's say the basis of that question, why was this book so important to you?
Of course. So yeah, it was liberating, number one, because I realized that, you know, I wasn't actually being selfish. I was focused on myself to grow myself, to become a better person, a bigger person, a more intelligent, a more capable, person, just because I thought that was a good thing to be. I didn't know that I was going to utilize that to benefit others. But by the time I became a young man, I was grown up and out of undergrad or whatever and on my own, lo and behold, I was a person who could help other people, lead other people, etc. So reading that book, I recognized that. And so at that time, like I said, I was 27 or so. And I was like, oh, my goodness, I did the right thing. I wasn't being a bad person because I was never self-centered. I was always in focusing on myself, always trying to find ways to help others. I mean, one of the most gratifying things for me is to be in the mode of helping. Like if you invite me to a party, for example, I'm not going to just stand around and enjoy the food and the drinks. I'm going to be alert to, you know, find a way to help the host to make the party a better party. It's like, oh, you know what? Don't worry about it. I'll take over the drink station. I'll make sure everybody's glass is always full and people are having a good time. Or you stick around afterwards to help clean up or whatever the case might be, right? And I do that just because, I mean, that just makes the party way more fun for me because I've contributed to its success in some way or another. So it was liberating, number one. Number two, it also really helped shape my worldview. Growing up, and so what we haven't talked about yet is when I grew up in a Muslim household. So what I was taught through Islam, I mean, it's sort of not exactly in one ear and out the other, but I didn't dwell on it and think on it too much as a younger person, really. But there was this thing in Islam that, you know, money is gold and silver, the two forms of money. I was like, okay, great, that's a Muslim thing, Islamic thing, wonderful. Then I read this book and it's talking about the necessity and the value of sound money, and it talks about gold and hard money, basically. And so for me, that really got my wheels turning because when I was in Europe, when I was in France studying and doing this business degree, there was zero talk of that type of thing. You know, what makes for real money, good money, whatever. And then in the middle of that 2 years, I stumbled my way into an internship at an investment bank in London, UK. So I spent whatever it was, I guess 5 months in the UK. And I observed a bunch of stuff. And anyways, long story short, I observed a bunch of things around me, both living in and exploring Europe, working at the bank. I read this book, wheels are turning, young mind is trying to understand and make sense of things. And why it ended up being so impactful, because the message in the book really, so it's kind of coincidental that all of these experiences were happening at once, but the message in the book really unpacks and helps make sense of these confusing observations that I was making. Confusing observation number one, travel all around France, the country's like a jewelry box, everything's perfect, whatever. Remote villages, you drive through it, everything's perfectly manicured, pristine or whatever, but nobody's working. Nobody's working. And it is an exaggeration. I mean, people work, obviously, but they certainly don't work like we work in North America. And North Americans don't even work like people in Asia, Far East Asia tend to work, right? So it's like, how is this possible? Because typically when you go, like for an example in India, it's a bit of a basket case economy still, in my opinion. And you see people languishing around. There's too many people, basically, and not enough work for all those people. So when people aren't working, it's not equated with pristine environments, super clean, super organized, et cetera, right? It's not a jewelry box. It's a bit filthy and smelly. So it's like, how does this happen when you don't work and you have all of this? And then the other observation was when I was at the banking internship and they were trying to teach me the ropes, right? It was very much, I mean, it's an environment only for autodidacts, because all they do is take you and throw you into the deep end and say, come up with the right answers, and we're not even half the time going to tell you what the questions are, but you better have the right answers at the end of this thing, right? So they give you a project and they say, you know, go figure it out, and they leave you alone for basically, but they're all watching you constantly. Like there's cameras on you constantly. Your coworkers who you think aren't observing you are tasked with observing you and reporting up to the boss. So anyways, you figure that out a little too late, or at least I did, into the whole internship. But at any rate, one of the things that I was working on was pricing out, figuring out how to price out these interest rate derivative products, vanilla swaps, cross-currency swaps, this, that, various options, swaptions, yada, yada, yada. I've forgotten most of it. But so this was back in the summer of 2002, the prevailing 10-year rate on the sterling at that time, because I was on the sterling rates, the sterling desk, sterling meaning the British pound. I think it was around 5-6%, let's call it, maybe even 7%. But they were saying that, well, no, now we need you to price it down at 0%, at negative 0.5% or whatever it was, a negative percentage, whatever it was. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought, well, that's just, you know, they're really testing my ability to make this model work and propose, you know, this is how I would price this type of stuff, right? As part of the learning exercise. It wasn't until after the fact, the internship was done, the MBA was done. I chose to come back to Canada and not take the offer with the bank because, again, that overarching sense of responsibility that's always nagging in my head. And I started to try and figure out, like, well, why would they have had me do that? That seems really weird. So long story short, I came up with the realization that debt was a huge problem in Europe. The only reason that you'd want to explore pricing something at the 0 or negative interest rate level is because there is a possibility you can't afford the interest payments on how much you've borrowed. And maybe the debt problem also explains my observation of not working a lot, but having a really nice lifestyle. And so there is ultimately more to the story than just that, than just debt. There is the neo-colonial model that France has very happily followed, which is now crumbling and falling apart on them. And our mutual friend Alex Craner does a good job of teaching us exactly what the neo-colonial model as concerns France and Africa, what it's all about. But I didn't get into all that once I got back into Canada. I just figured out for myself that, okay, debt's a problem. So what is money actually then? Because in Atlas Shrugged, it talks about sound money and whatever. So, you know, you go down the rabbit holes of what is money, how is money created, who actually has control over it. You get into interest rates and bond market, whatever. So I was doing a lot of that on my own once I came back to Canada and returned to the family business. But the book was so impactful to me, on me, in terms of helping me understand who I am and who I wanted to be and what I wanted to create around me, that any meaningful relationship I was going to have there forward, I thought the best way for someone to understand a person who might be as complex as myself and as potentially abrasive as myself, because I don't like to just go along to get along, or get along. How does the saying go? Go along to get along, right? Yeah. That's not the type of person that I am. So it's like, well, if you want to understand me, if you want to have a relationship with me, read this book. So who did I give the book to? Once I finally took over the business, well, actually, prior to that, I met the girlfriend at the time who became my wife, who's Darcy, who you know. I made her read it. It's like, if we're going to last as a couple, you're going to want to read this book. You're really going to want to get inside my head and understand, because I don't know if I can explain myself as well as this book can explain me. So here, read this book. And she struggled with it for a while. It's the first 300 pages is rough. But if you can get past the first 300 pages, the book carries you forward by itself. It's a compelling, captivating story.
And even if you can't do that, I still suggest people to listen to it on Audible, for example, because to me, it's an extremely important book. And another mutual friend of ours, Tom Luongo, had suggested it at one point.
Oh, did he?
And yeah, it was kind of a throwaway line. And
oh, okay. I don't remember hearing that.
I needed something at the time. I needed a new book.
Oh, he recommended it to you personally. Yeah. Oh, okay.
And the same thing. Like, I just identified so much with a couple of the characters in that book, with how they approach life, how they approach their work ethic, everything like that. And this idea of the virtue of selfishness that ends up benefiting the greater good, or being beneficial to the greater good.
Yeah.
I think is such an important point that ends up being lost. And this kind of ties together all the ideas of passion, intrinsic motivation, work ethic, being good at something, and exploring that to your potential, right? Realizing your potential within that particular field. You know, for myself, when I became a welder and I took my welding business to that extreme that I wanted to achieve, my mindset became solely focused on being the best welder in any project that I went to, that I could be, right? Like, the name that I came up with for my company was Ruthless Industries, because I was ruthless about being the best, about having the fewest repairs, about getting,
fewest callbacks.
Exactly.
Or whatever. Negative callbacks, is, I guess, because you kind of do want to get called back for another project.
Exactly.
Sorry. Yeah.
But I think that really captures, your mindset as well as my mindset in a completely different field, right?
Right.
And I think it was very helpful to you, for people in your life. Not only you made your fiance or your wife at the time read it, but also some upper level management.
Yeah. Right? So when I finally took over the business from my dad, he passed away in 2008, and so then it became my business, because I acquired it off the estate, and decided, well, I haven't spent the last, at that point, 34 years of my, well, not quite 34 years, call it 20 years of my life, not becoming a concert violinist and pursuing freaking chemical engineering. I'm not going to just walk away from this thing. Like, this is it. This is my chance to make something of it. My dad ran it as a lifestyle business, and I had no desire to run it as a lifestyle business. I was going to make something out of it. Coming back to fulfill your potential, I was going to fulfill my potential, but I was also wanting to fulfill the potential of the business. It had a lot of potential, but it was so poorly run. I think my dad was in the deep end in terms of what he had gotten himself into, and in retrospect, I think he just kept it hanging on to the point that he could have his son eventually take the reins. He didn't really know what he was doing with the business, to be frank. He was way better off as a real estate investor than he was a businessman. But so fulfill the potential of the company and fulfill the potential of the chemistry. It's a chemical manufacturing business. So fulfill the potential that lay dormant inside these molecules that we were working with. So I announced to the leadership team at the business when I walked in after I took it over, and I was like, this is not going to be the same company that you've been accustomed to for the past, gosh, at that point it would have been 20 some odd years, 25 years, let's call it. I'm going to be running it very differently, but you guys all have a grace period to decide whether or not you're going to be with me and make something out of this business, rather than being happy with breaking even at the end of every year or just suffering mild losses at the end of the year. We're actually going to make profits, and we're going to make ridiculous profits, and then we're going to sell it. And it's not going to be an easy ride. So the grace period, your 6 months that I'm giving you 6 months to read this book, Atlas Shrugged. You will understand who I am as a person and what I think and how I intend to move forward, on what principles I intend to move forward. And if you decide that you want to stick with me, that'll be great. If you don't, after finishing the book and discussing it with me and asking me any questions that you might have, then we'll figure out how to package you out, and you can carry on with your life, and I'll be free to do what I want to do. And I think it worked well. Nobody left after having read the book. I think it led to some interesting conversations. I don't know if everybody embraced it the way I would have hoped or imagined that everybody will embrace this philosophy, because, I mean, you get set in your ways, I suppose, but they didn't get in my way. And yeah, so it's, I mean, I don't do it anymore. I'm past that stage, but I think anybody who really wants to understand what I feel is important, what really motivates the type of discussion that we're having here today, can be unpacked through the story that's told in that book.
And I think the way you just phrased that is not as helpful as it could be, because maybe not everybody's interested in how you think or how you see the world. But I think it's extremely instructive on these values and these virtues of hard work, of fighting for what's right, for what you believe is right, of really the value or the virtue of selfishness in a particular aim, of being, very, very single-minded in achieving a goal. And
and an advocacy of personal responsibility, right? Because that's a very major theme in that book. It's, Ayn Rand, she illustrates how it rots out a human being, rots out an individual soul, rots out a community as well, when personal responsibility is forsaken for, living off of, existing by riding other people's coattails, in a manner of speech, right? She illustrates it that way, and then she illustrates the opposite of how prosperous, self-enriching it is to take personal responsibility and be the, as you call it, the competent man, competent woman, and how liberating and enriching it can be to take that level of personal responsibility in all respects of your life. I'm not saying, become a person that, can exist solely on their own in order that you do exist solely on your own. I think it's wonderful to have relationships, but I don't think you should enter into relationships to compensate for that which you can't do on your own. I think there should be more to the relationship than, well, now I've got a wife, so I've got somebody who's going to wash my clothes and iron my shirts and this and that or whatever. Like, if push comes to shove and you need to break up because it was a bad match, you should be able to stand up on your own again. You shouldn't just, and I've seen so many examples where men just get, go out, find a spouse because they need a caretaker. It's ridiculous. It's pathetic. It makes me even angry to think about sometimes.
I've often said, entering into relationships or just in other discussions, that a relationship should be 1 + 1 = 3. That synergy of two people should add up to a greater sum than just the two individuals. And I think that kind of speaks towards being able to be A, self-sufficient, but B, create a better synergy with somebody.
Yeah, like a well-oiled team can produce way more than, like you said, 1+1 ends up equaling 3, not just 2. And one needs to keep in mind that just because you are a well-rounded individual, you are a competent person, when you get together in a team, good teamwork, let's talk about a baseball team. A well-functioning baseball team, every player doesn't have their hand in the same glove. The whole team isn't holding the bat every time, there's a swing to be taken, right? You have your dedicated roles. You got the guy who's on first, you got the guy who's on second, third, the different outfielders, the shortstop, the pitcher, whatever, right? They can switch positions if they needed to and fill the other roles that might need to be done. But during any given moment in the game, they've got their dedicated tasks that they need to focus on. So the same thing in a relationship. Like the way it is in our household, some would choose to criticize it as being traditional, but my wife and I, we've got our own areas of responsibility. I can do what she does. She can do what I can do in some respects, but we don't overlap. There's no point to overlapping. Now, she's away this week. She's away on a business trip, as you know. And, I mean, we're still alive. We're still surviving, right? Like, we can get the meals cooked, and if we had to do the laundry and iron the shirts or whatever, all that stuff would get done. But when she comes home, she takes over that part of it, and I do what I do. And in a traditional sense, I guess the way you'd map it out is everything that's external focused from the household is my responsibility. Everything that's internally focused is her responsibility. But if she has to be out of the home, I can focus on the insides as well. And I used to travel on business extensively when I had the business before I exited. So she had to look after the outward focusing stuff. But when I came home, I had to take over back the responsibility that was mine.
This idea of personal responsibility kind of couples with this idea that I think we need more and higher quality leaders in this world.
Yep.
I think I've talked many times about incentives and how incentives create the outcomes that we have.
Show me the incentives, I'll tell you the outcomes. Who says that? Is that Rick Rule? Somebody we listen to on a regular basis, or you personally know Rick Rule. Somebody like Rick has said something like that, but yeah.
But when we, as we think about through this era of, let's say, 2020 to 2025, where we currently are, we can point to a whole plethora of horrific leadership mistakes, horrific leaders that we've had. And I think a lot of this kind of comes back to personal morality and
absolutely,
and how one's character ends up really shaping the type of leader, if put into that role, that you're going to be. I think one of the best quotes that I ever heard is that character is doing the right thing when nobody is looking, right?
Right, yeah. That's a great quote.
Having that discipline to say, instead of leaving the dishes here, obviously a very trite example, instead of leaving the dishes here and doing it later, and it doesn't matter, I'm going to do it now because it's easier to do now, and then it's done. And this idea also I'd like to touch on, taking action, but getting back to the point of leadership and these qualities of being able to take action, I think this ends up kind of coming back to the idea of personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. So an easy way that I think to kind of explain this is, for myself, I've traveled extensively as well, and I remember being in Mexico. And that's a place where I think people do take a lot of personal responsibility, right? If you come to a stoplight and you take the responsibility for your safety into your own hands, you look left and right, you deem it to be safe, the only thing that's stopping you from wasting your time sitting at a traffic light
Yeah.
is yourself. It's not
Yeah.
the light. The light is simply a signaling mechanism, right?
Yeah.
You take the personal responsibility to say, I deem it to be safe. I take my safety into my own hands. I'm going to go.
Yeah.
Or one of the other examples is, if you're lacking money, most of these people have a day job, and you see them working their asses off, slinging tacos or fixing some shitty old trucks or whatever
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
At all times of the day, these people work so hard because they take personal responsibility to say, I want to make a little bit more money because I need to make ends meet, whatever that is. I think that's been very lost in Western society, let's say Canada and the US.
Yeah.
So what does taking personal responsibility mean to you?
Well, the reason I really like that quote that you mentioned earlier, it's how did you say it again? It's character
Character is doing the right thing when nobody else is watching.
Yeah. So, for me, personal responsibility is, largely that. It shouldn't matter who's looking or if anybody's looking. You're looking at it. It should matter just for yourself. You should never do anything to appease others or to elevate your own personal image in somebody else's eyes. If you can't, if you are not your own greatest critic, then what's the point of what you're doing, right? So personal responsibility, how would I define it? Personal responsibility to me means, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I can define it easily.
Well, maybe not even defining it, because I think it's kind of like the quality around, or the discussion around quality. Nobody can really tell you what it is, but you and I can both look at something and say, that's quality, whatever that looks like. We can't necessarily put our finger on it and put words around it, but we can identify it, right?
Yeah.
But maybe give me an example of how you see taking personal responsibility and in some ways leading by example versus, this contrast of our society not being willing, or the majority of our society now not being willing to take personal responsibility.
Yeah, I think the reason personal responsibility is being so eroded in our society today is because there is, particularly in Canadian society, there is, an overarching socialist flavor to this country. There is some unseeable, unknown, I shouldn't say unknown, but we call it the government, but this blob out there, you can't really define it and draw a circle around it, you just call it the government, looks after so many things for us, right? And so I think that has largely eroded our sense of personal responsibility. But why I say personal responsibility is important to me and how I try to live by that mantra is I hate relying on anybody else. I hate being dependent on anybody else. I'm not saying I shouldn't, sometimes depend on my wife or somebody else, but I just hate being in a position where I can't call the shots for myself. For example, if we got to go out or something like that, I'll take my own car because I want to be able to have my own, whatever, call it escape route, escape mechanism if I feel I need to exercise it. And I don't want to have to rely on somebody else and say, well, can we go? Can you cut your time short at the party as well and drive me home or whatever? So yeah, for me, personal responsibility means, number one, being able to take care of yourself at any given moment. Number two, arriving at the end of it all, at the end of your life with a clear conscience, a satisfied conscience a conscience that feels like it's done something meaningful with its time here on Earth, right? Again, what does it mean to be born? What does it mean to be alive? Doing something with the answers to those questions that you've come up with. That is what personal responsibility, I guess, means to me.
So one of the things that kind of brought you and I together, or is the reason you and I even met in the first place, was the idea of gold. You know,
Yeah,
kind of
that's
being
the common
in this particular industry, if you want to call it that.
Before you explore that question, you know, it occurred to me, you asked for maybe a couple of examples of what does personal responsibility mean to me. I never expected to inherit anything from my parents. I still don't expect to. So the nest egg and the capital and the wealth that I've built up and I'm trying to preserve, it's all built up on my own. You know, a critic of someone who wanted to be critical of me might say, well, you inherited this business. No, I didn't actually inherit it. I bought it, you know, at fair value. And I did something with it without ever thinking that, well, you know, one day mom or dad's going to die and I'm going to get the inheritance off of that and that'll patch the hole in my finances or whatever the case might be, right? So that's one example of the way I look at things. I also, in terms of personal responsibility, take a look at the fact that, so my wife and I, we don't have children. Typically what happens is as you get older, you look to your children to hopefully be able to help you out in whichever ways you need, you know, get me groceries, make sure I'm, you know, haven't fallen and can't get up sort of thing. And so knowing that we don't have that, we won't have that luxury, if we can call it a luxury, in the future, already talking about and thinking about what do we need to do? How do we need to manage ourselves in order that we can continue to have the dignity of life that we want to have and the freedoms and the lifestyle that we want to have, knowing that we will be old one day and we won't have these luxuries just to automatically fall upon. We have to take responsibility for ourselves today. We have to make certain sacrifices or plan things out in certain ways today in order to be able to live that life that we want to live. So I hope that amounts to a couple of examples of what personal responsibility means to me, or how I try to live up to my sense of personal responsibility.
Yeah, again, I think it's just holding ourselves to a particular standard, right?
Right.
And in a lot of ways, you know, obviously not letting that standard slide, but also kind of living in that practice, if you will, of high standards, high character, whatever, however we can describe that, bringing that idea of doing our best, whether it's doing the dishes, whether it's mowing the lawn, whether it is building a business, whether it is doing research for something that either of us are passionate in, it is extremely important to always be doing your best, or to be at least deliberate about bringing that standard into every facet of your life. And I think, you know, that's something that's extremely important to myself. And I think that's something that, you know, why you and I bonded very quickly is because I can see, you know, how particular you are about everything you do. And
OCD is what it's called, I think.
I don't know that it's
I'll just
to
be
that extent.
self-deprecating humor.
Of
that's
course,
all. Yeah,
of course. But you know, maybe a more generous way of speaking to yourself is
Right.
to say that you're upholding a high standard through everything that
Absolutely.
you do.
And you know, the idea of high standards is something that I've spoken about. You know, as I was getting to know Darcy early in our relationship, and we were figuring each other out and finding how we mesh or whatever. one of the things that she would sometimes argue back to me is like, well, nobody else does it this way. No other families do it this way or whatever, right? Whatever the debate or argument was at the time. And I was like, I don't freaking care how, Joe Blow down the street does it or, your childhood friend does it. It's like, we have our own standards. We need to create our own standards for ourselves, that which makes sense for us and allows us to get to where we want to get to, over the course of this marriage and our life together. Playing down to the lowest common denominator of society is the absolute worst way.
It's how we can remain average or become average.
Not even average, but absolutely decimate society. Like, look at what's happening in the public education system. They teach down to the lowest common denominator, to the lowest skill set in the room so that, everybody can feel like they're doing a good job because everybody passed. Well, it's going to sound a little crass, but if you cater to the dumbest kid in the room, guess what? The only person who's benefiting maybe is the dumb kid. And you've got the rest who have this potential because they're more intelligent or more capable in whatever respect, and they're getting undernourished. What the heck is the point of that? So standards are vitally important. Absolutely.
That was certainly like perfectly described for my case. When I was challenged with something, a perfect example would be when I was in middle school and I took up playing the trumpet. I was super motivated by the challenge of learning something that I had zero interest in, really. But I became really good at it really fast because I was super stoked on the challenge of it. And then once I caught up and surpassed everybody around me, and we were still at that, that low level of learning, that low incline plane of learning, and that's the challenge that was being served to me, I lost interest in it, and I ended up becoming the worst player by the end of the semester because I didn't give a shit about it anymore. Right. There was no challenge there, and like my interest ended up waning in it because it was the actual challenge, not playing the trumpet, that was actually interesting me.
Right, exactly. And so you've got so much of that across society today, because this isn't a recent phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for decades, for at least I would say the last 50 years, if not the last 80 years, since the West thought it was triumphantly won the world. I mean, you had the Cold War, but after World War II, the West emerged as, look at us, we did it. Primarily America. Look at us, we did it. We've set the tone for the rest of history to come, and I think there was some positive momentum that carried on after that. You had the 50s, but then some of the rot started to set in the 60s and certainly through the 70s, and then in the early 70s we got ourselves off the gold standard, and money just, if you study the history of money just became profligate and meaningless, and this rot has been going on for a long time. This is not, like I said, a recent phenomenon. It's not just since COVID happened and whatever, and the reason I call out the COVID era is because that was the siren song for many people that got them to get out of their somnambulant state, their state of sleepwalking, and go, wait a second, things don't add up. Well, guess what? They actually haven't added up for a way, way, way longer time. And, it's maybe hard to parse it all out and dissect it and understand it post-World War II. But certainly by 1971, August 15th, 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, got out of the, what was it called, Bretton Woods system, certainly it's a lot easier to trace the trajectory of rot in society. And, when money is so abundant and so free and so easy to create through just credit, like every time you use your damn credit card, you're creating money. You have no idea that you're doing, but you're adding to the money supply. If you happen to pay off that credit card bill at the end of the month, fine, you inflated the money supply, but then you crashed the money supply at the end by paying off the debt. By that whatever the size of your credit card bill was. Let's call it $5,000. But the point is, as we've gone through this era of just abundance of credit, which is now coming to an end, we can see the symptoms of that, the markers of that. We've just rotted out society. You can create all these welfare programs. You can make all sorts of promises that, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren will have to figure out how to pay off because, heck, I need votes. I'll press the print button, so to speak, and buy the votes for myself. And we've gotten ourselves into such a deep mess over it. But it brings me back to something you just glanced upon earlier in the conversation today about morality. It's a common mantra in our subculture about sound money, hard money, gold, whatever you want to call it, about fix the money, fix the world. And it's kind of true. Like, you can tie back a lot of what we see as problems today as being a result of a loose, dishonest monetary system, right? But fix the money doesn't alone fix the world, because fix the money will only temporarily fix the world. The only way we stop ourselves from backsliding, right, is if we also fix morality. Morality is something, again, by my estimation, intentionally being corrupted over the course of time.
Maybe they actually go hand in hand.
They do. Like, the looseness of money, it's a self-reinforcing cycle, and negative reinforcing is what it is, right? Loose, corrupt money begets immoral behavior. Immoral behavior begets more and more corruption of the money system. But let's say you just fix the money. Yeah, you'd fix all these problems maybe, and there's a laundry list of problems that you could name. But if the morality hasn't been fixed, then give it another generation or two and you will have slid backwards. You run the risk of sliding backwards, of going back to corrupting money. Like, just look at it on a broader time scale. The Roman Empire is often quoted as having corrupted their money supply, and it led to their downfall. Well, okay, the Roman Empire ended I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of years ago it is now, 1,500 years ago or something, maybe more, whatever it is. They corrupted their money system. They died as a result of it. Humanity rediscovered sound money at some point after that, and we've had other civilizations, other empires rise, but we keep going through this cycle of rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. Why, after rediscovering sound money, have we gone back again and corrupted it? Why, after World War II, did we have a sound money system, and yet again, for the umpteenth time, as human species, are at a point of ultra corrupted money? It's because we haven't adhered to a sense of morality, a permanent sense, at any rate, of morality. Morality seems to go through cycles as much as, the soundness and the corruptness of money seems to go through cycles. So unless and until we can fix the morality, there's almost kind of, in conjunction with fixing the money, there's almost no point to saying, how do we fix the problems? I think these are the fundamental points that need to get addressed. And I see, well, the money thing is getting addressed. I think we're on the cusp of something very, very big again, sort of paradigm shifting. But I don't see anybody talking about the morality side of it. And, we might get shock and awed into, going back to church and saying, well, maybe I better dust off the old Bible off the shelf and reread it. But I don't think that's anything more than surfacious at this point. I don't see humanity being woken up back to morality.
We almost need a reset in terms of money, obviously, and a reset in terms of morality, coupled with a diligent study to keep us on the right track, to keep us, to inform the human species of these are the mistakes that you have repeated over and over and over. You know, we've talked at length about these cycles of history that just keep repeating themselves. And humanity doesn't learn that lesson. So it's almost like we need a diligent study of, okay, we need to go through a bunch of pain to fix the money, which in turn causes, like I said, a lot of pain, and to fix morality, which will cause a lot of pain as well. And then have our faces, you know, stuffed in that time after time to make sure that we somehow learn that lesson. I don't honestly know if that is possible because it has been repeated so many times.
I tend to agree with you. It might not even be possible. It just might be human nature to, you've heard me say it before, fuck around and then find out.
Exactly. Well, I mean, and you know, that's a concept that humanity is going to have, let's say, their fingers slammed in the door with.
Yeah, it's happening right now. Our fingers are in that crack and the door is picking up momentum right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this brings us nicely into this other idea of really being a contrarian, right? You and I come from the world of, let's just call it gold investing. That's how we met. And the odd part about this is that it's a really small club.
It's a really small club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a small club with some very eccentric characters within it.
Yeah.
You know, you have people that are doomers and preppers, all the way to people that seem to be, you know, for all intents and purposes, very rational, very, what's the right word for that? Conservative. Without the political intonations of that, right? Very...
Yeah, just conservative in the way they approach their everyday life. Yeah, not politically speaking.
You know, maybe careful.
Measured,
Yeah.
you know, yeah.
So where do you think that this contrarian nature was taught to you from? And you know, with going into this answer, the context that you had kind of mentioned earlier was you had seen 2008 coming. You'd seen that crash coming, although you were early, as we both have been to many of these ideas.
Yeah.
Early can be the same as being wrong.
Yeah, right, but
in a
early
way.
can be the same as being wrong, yeah.
Exactly. So where does this contrarian nature for you come from?
I think it probably comes from just growing up in my dad's shadow, right? He always was a self-professed contrarian. He's like, you know, I will never do, I can't do what the crowds do or whatever. And, you know, you could see it demonstrated in the way he behaved as well. He was very much his own man. So I think, you know, it's less of a nature thing for me than it is a nurture thing for me, the idea of being a contrarian. So I observed it and I admired, I mean, he had his flaws and faults as well, of course, but I admired him for what he was and I understood his flaws. I understood the human being that he was. And in sum total, I think he's a man who's worthy of admiration, or at least of understanding the character. And so that aspect of his character is something that I clearly have held on to. I've chosen to be a contrarian. But, you know, I don't think you can just choose to be a contrarian, announce that, well, I'm a contrarian because my dad's a contrarian. I think, you know, you only really become a contrarian if you live and breathe it, if you understand what it means, if you are genuinely repulsed by the idea of following the crowd, or following the crowd makes you nervous or whatever, you know, that internal signal goes off in you in whichever way it does and alerts you to the fact that, oh, you're just following the crowd here. I remember there was this time, it's kind of funny and illustrative how geeky and awkward, socially awkward I was as a child, but the local community center in my neighborhood, so I'm talking about my teenage years, I would have been like, I don't know, 15, 16, something like that. No, even younger than that. At any rate, before high school. So yeah, probably like 12 or 13 it would have been. And the community center organizes these dances, right? So all the kids in school, it's like, oh, we should get together beforehand and we'll all whatever end up at the dance, whatever, at the community center. And we're all standing about. So there's this apartment complex in the neighborhood on the way towards the school, the community center, and everybody's just standing there, and it's kind of huddled in different little cliques, but just this mob of kids. And I was just like, okay, so what the heck is actually going on? And I piped up at one point. It's like, well, what are we doing? What are we doing here, right? Like, so this is another thing that we can talk about later on, perhaps, is purpose. But there was no purpose to being there. Like, there was no objective. It's just like, I guess the answer would have been we're socializing. But for me, it was like, well, can't we socialize while working on something? There's nothing productive happening here, right? So, that is my earliest conscious example of me being a contrarian. It's like, well, the crowd is doing this, and this is dumb. So I went home. I was like, screw the dance. I don't need to go to the dance. If we got to spend, an hour just standing around, and it was the fall time too, so it's not like particularly warm or whatever, right? I was like, this seems dumb, so I just left. I bring up the example. It's just to illustrate that, I'm not a contrarian just because I decided I was going to be a contrarian because my dad was. Somehow or another, I trained my mind to understand the idiocy, the madness of following a crowd, right? So while that's an early example, it's been a part of who I am ever since. And some might say that, well, that just means you're a loner. That's what that is. That's not you being a contrarian. But no. Another example would be how I chose to turn around the business once I took it over. The industry was going without getting into the nauseating details of it all, the industry was choosing to go in a certain direction. And I was like, well, no, I'm going to go in this direction, and I'm going to continue pushing to the point that my contrarian approach to it will shake the whole industry up, disrupt. In other words, that big buzzword now.
Yeah, I was
to
going
be
to
a
say,
disruptor.
I'm a disruptor.
Yeah. So, but that is part and parcel the product of being a contrarian. Is you disrupt. It's like, what's the big buzz this week about the disruption in the business world? This DeepSeek AI model out of China chose to do things totally differently. All of these other examples of AI models, so what are the different companies? OpenAI, with their product is ChatGPT, I think, right? Then you've got Twitter or X, and their model is called Grok, or the public-facing side of it is called Grok. And there's some other ones out there. I'm not fully conversant on all the different ones. But
Google had one too that was like a complete failure. Gemini, I think, right?
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, well, it was a complete failure because it turned out to be like super racist and, well, yeah, woke, but in being so adherent, compliant to wokeism, turned out to be absolutely racist. So that's
But it was like reverse racist because it illustrated
racist.
Hitler as being black or something, right?
Yeah, just like stupid, idiotic crap that was just nonsense, right? So anyways, thank God that one failed. But anyway, so there's these different models, and all these different companies, they just did it one way. More power, more energy, more processors, more. And whoever these guys behind DeepSeek in China, I'm told it was a side project even, not even a real business. It's just they had a bunch of leftover, what are called GPUs, processors, that they would have thrown into the landfill had they not found another use for it. They're like, well, rather than throwing them out, what if we hooked them up and came up with an AI model of our own? Well, we don't have that much, and we don't want to throw a lot of money on it, so they took a contrarian approach, and you can delve into the details if you want online. People are explaining why it's so disruptive, but contrarianism leads to disruption. And that's going to happen in our space that brings you and I together. You're talking about gold or sound money is what brings us together. This contrarian approach is going to be exceedingly disruptive. You and I enjoyed a lovely social affair with our mutual friend Jaime Carrasco last night over dinner, and we were talking with him, and he was explaining to us, because it's shop talk for him. He knows the subject better than I certainly do. And he was just explaining the magnitude of the disruption that, guys like you and I have positioned ourselves for. But, contrarianism leads to disruption invariably. And I guess that's, part and parcel of who I am as a contrarian, willing to take the very long view, because it requires pardon the language again, shit ton of patience. It takes the patience of an absolute saint, and there are numerous opportunities presented to you to bail out of your contrarian position, and you got to avoid that temptation. You got to have belief in what it is that you've chosen to subscribe yourself to. So, one day, what did we call it? I'm going to get it wrong again. Deferred gratification. I don't know why I always want to call it gratitude. Deferred gratification. Yeah, so you got to be willing to tolerate a lot of deferred gratification when you're a contrarian as well, because there's afraid the maddening something of crowds or whatever. The madness of crowds. But, the madness of crowds can go on for a very long time. They've got a lot of momentum, because momentum is mass times velocity, right? And the mass of a big crowd is way higher than the mass of the handful of contrarians. And so that momentum will allow them to keep pulling things in the wrong direction for a long time, a very long time, much longer than you might imagine. But when the elastic finally snaps, it snaps back hard, and that's the disruption, and that's what we're hoping to capture in our favor. So I don't know if I answered the question. I don't even remember what the original question was now.
Where your contrarian nature came from.
Right, and how I might practice it. So yeah, I think it came from my dad, like I said, but it also then, I cultivated it internally. I guess what I did was I observed my dad announcing himself and behaving like a contrarian, and just really understanding what he meant by not following crowds, and taking that lens, putting it in front of my eyes, and observing my own life, like that example as a mob of kids on this front lawn of this apartment building going, what the heck does this mean? Nothing, I'm out, right?
As you're bringing up this example of, let's just call it the Western AI models being built, our default is to always add more to solve problems. And I heard a story recently about, there was an architect or an engineer trying to build this bridge. And as he's building this bridge model, he needed to add load capacity without adding weight. And
that was a problem, challenge we had. It wasn't even, this was before I even got to engineering. It was, I don't know, you call it like a pre-engineering course, but it was in high school. In my final year of high school, and you were given popsicle sticks. And the challenge was build a bridge that could hold more weight, like hold the most weight, so it was a competition, but your score was going to be based not on how much weight you could hold, but the ratio between what your bridge itself weighed and how much weight it was able to sustain. So anyways, that just reminded me of that popsicle stick project.
Well, this is exactly this idea. And again, this fits perfectly into the ways of thinking that I want to convey, or the ways of maybe changing our thinking that I want to convey on this podcast. Yeah. This is a perfect example and a perfect idea that we can illustrate it by to show the listeners how to flip our thinking on its head in a way. And so going back to this example, this engineer was trying to build this bridge. He kept adding weight to try to increase the load capacity, but because he kept adding weight, that ended up, he wasn't able to achieve the desired result.
He was fighting against himself.
Because he kept adding weight, which ended up being counterproductive. Yeah. So the story as I heard it, I think I might have heard it on a podcast or read it in a book or wherever. Yeah. And the story goes that his 7-year-old son came over, rearranged it while he wasn't looking, and solved the problem perfectly by subtracting. Instead of...
How would the 7-year-old kid have figured that out? Or was
just because that was his instinct, was to rebuild it in a way that subtracted material. That's interesting. Right? I think so many times we, as human beings, for some reason we have this knee-jerk reaction to add complexity to try to solve a problem rather than take complexity away. So I had this model in a way in my head, and taking this idea of flipping something on its head to be able to achieve the desired result, right? Like taking a step back to think about a problem, taking 2 steps back to think about the problem in all these possible solutions rather than being hyper-focused on the one solution to the problem. So the example that I had applied this to in real life was I was on a fishing trip shortly after I had heard this example or read this example. And we were running out of daylight and we needed to get off the river. And at one point we had gone through this little village and we were so hyper-focused on how we were going to basically hitchhike. We had to basically walk up to the highway, which was a considerable distance from where we were, to be able to hitchhike, to get back to the truck, to be able to get back to the boat and pick everything up and pick everybody up, hopefully before dark. But we were way too hyper-focused on this idea of trying to find a ride when my friend whose boat it was, didn't even realize that he knew somebody in that village that he could have just texted. Right? Yeah. And we didn't think about this until about 2 hours after dark when we're all sitting there freezing our asses off. Right. And it's this idea that I applied, this framework that I applied to this problem, thinking, we're so stuck on this one way of trying to solve the problem. Yeah. We're so stuck in this one channel when there was a perfect solution to the problem that was just adjacent. Yeah. A much better solution, in fact, that was just adjacent.
Yeah, and sometimes not even just adjacent, but sitting there right in your...
Literally in your phone.
In your phone, or right there in your, set of puzzle pieces or whatever it is that you're trying to resolve. So that
it was almost, it's almost like outside of your field of view. So again, it's this idea to me of taking complexity away to reveal all of that field of view for possible solutions to this problem, rather than being narrowly focused on one solution and how do we get to that one road to get back to the truck, rather than what are the different possibilities to even get to the truck.
Yeah, or just getting, I think if I understand it correctly, because as I'm listening to you, I'm trying to dig up in my own mind, from my own past experience, a similar type of phenomenon. And if I understand you correctly, what you're talking about is just getting so locked into the way you're choosing to solve your problem, rather than reassessing the entire problem from first principles, so to speak. So, the example that comes to mind in my experience is, like I said, I took this business, and once I finally got to get into the books and really, lay bare the nuts and bolts of what I'd chosen to, apply myself to, acquire from the family, acquire from my dad's estate and do something with. It was like, holy crap, this thing is really broken. At the same time, so he passed away in March 2008. At the same time, the global economy passed away, so to speak, the global financial crisis, right? And then there's all the family turmoil with the inheritance and with the estate. And so that is not a relevant part to the story, but I've got this rotten business. I've got my dad who's had one way of trying to get revenue, make money, turn a profit, whatever. And it's resulted in this horrible mess, right? And, the first instinct is to just sell more. You need to make more profit, just sell more product. Well, the problem was, given our constrained set of resources, what I came to realize was, given our constrained set of resources, selling more was too difficult and too expensive an exercise for us because we weren't turning profits. There wasn't free cash flow. I was unwilling to get into debt. The one good thing that my dad did, as bad of a businessman as he was, he didn't leave debt behind. And I think he adhered to that religiously, in both metaphorically and literally. He adhered to that literally because he didn't want to burden me in that way. So bless him for that. So at least I didn't inherit any debt per se, but there was no way to expand the activity, to try and reach out to markets that we weren't participating in or whatever, right? So I just said, you know what, we've got to be able to jailbreak this problem that seems unsolvable. We need more cash flow and we have no resources, and now's not the time that I'm going to be able to go into debt because global financial crisis. Plus just a general unwillingness to carry debt anyway. So I was like, well, what we're going to do is we're going to sell less. And that's how what we're going to do is we're going to withdraw whatever resources we have from every single area of the business that we've been trying to push all these years. And we're going to focus on the one product line where we have any level of reputation or brand recognition. That's what we're going to do. Not permanently, but to get us through the crisis, to get us through the problem, to get to the point where we actually have some free cash flow and some profits to speak of, to be able to do all the other things you need to do to then grow the business. And so that's what we applied. I applied from 2008 to 2012, 4 years of one product. I don't care what. If somebody's coming along and saying, without any effort on my part, and says, I want to buy that product that you guys make, but that I'm not focusing on, for sure, I'd take that. But if it required any resources to get that sale, I wasn't interested in that sale. I was going to put all the resources into the one thing. So it's kind of an example, maybe illustrates what you're saying, that taking away, simplifying, actually led to more. So, by 2000 and, when was it, 2009? Yeah, probably by 2010, 11-ish, we had our first $1 million year, $1 million profit. This is a company that would regularly lose between $100,000 to $500,000, in the worst case, $500,000 in a year. And we now turned $1 million profit, focusing on one single product, whittled it down to one single salesperson, which was me. So I was going all around the world being the salesperson for this thing, by which I actually mean just being an educator, because this is a product that can sell itself so long as people could understand it. And it worked. And we became...
So almost focusing on being really, really good at one thing, rather than being too broad.
Yeah, exactly. So the field of chemistry is known as silicone. And more specifically, we focused on what's called RTV, silicone, room temperature vulcanizing. You just, it's like a caulking tube. When you go to put some caulking around your bathtub or your kitchen sink, you squirt it out of the caulking gun, it gets exposed to the humidity, moisture in the air, and it goes from a goopy consistency into a solid rubber over the course of, say, 24 hours. That vulcanized, it turned from goop into solid rubber. It vulcanized at room temperature, and it was a one component. It's not like an epoxy, two components getting mixed and blah, blah, blah. So that was our special field of specialty. So we had a number of different products in that space. We had all those different types of caulkings, not so much for the consumer application like I just described at household use, but more specialized stuff for, circuit boards, cars, fire stop material, blah, 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 right? We had, I think, a product line of 140, 150 different products. I'm not talking about SKUs, I'm talking about formulated products, 140 maybe. And I took it down to the one product line, which was 3 formulations. I said, we're just working on 3 formulations. Somebody knocks on the door or picks up the phone and calls us to buy any of the other stuff. We had the equipment, we had the materials, we know how to make it, let's make it and sell it. But yeah, totally simplifying the thing. And so we then grew to become a company, and I took over the business in 2008, and I sold the first tranche in 2018. I sold the second tranche in 2019. So call it, between 10 to 11 years is how long it took me to go from inheriting, taking over, acquiring this mess, and turning it into a fairly significant financial success story when I exited. It didn't take that much time, and I attribute it to simplifying as much as possible. We did then pour those profits heavily back into R&D, reinvesting in the business. We came up with new products, product lines, new formulations that leveraged what we had created through this simplification of approach to the market. So it wasn't like the forever solution was to stay simplified, but it got us through a very deep crisis rather successfully. We went on to become a company that dominated 70% of global market share in this specific field. Now, I'm not talking about a billion-dollar industry. It was fairly niche, but on a global perspective, when you're outplaying multi-billion-dollar companies like Dow Corning in the U.S., Wacker Chemie out of Germany, I mean, these are mega multi-billion-dollar chemical conglomerates who rightfully should have been able to chase us out of the market entirely, but they couldn't outwit us, they couldn't outsmart us because we were way too agile. Because we had simplified, we became super agile, and we could out-innovate them as well. So, I mean, I don't want this to turn into a whole story of how I turned around a business, but yeah, simplifying to solve a problem is probably where we ought to really start with everything. You and I were talking the other day about a specific problem that you faced, and I was saying from my engineering education, how would I approach that problem? And really, I think what I was trying to articulate was, how do we take this problem in front of us and simplify it so that we can wrap our heads around it fully and then figure out what needs to be done once we've stripped all the noise out of the informational noise that's facing us. Simplify it in our minds first.
Yeah, kind of conceptualizing what the actual, really defining what the actual problem is by setting a boundary around the problem, to therefore be able to come up with possible solutions to the problem. Zeroing in on the actual issue, because what I was describing was a braking system that had somewhat failed, and actually figuring out where the problem was within one of the parts rather than looking at the entire system as a whole, sitting there scratching my head.
Yeah, being able to break it down into its components and bit by bit go through it, test hypothesis, just test the system that's in front of you as well and see what happens. And yeah, if you can compartmentalize and break down, but even more than just compartmentalizing and breaking down, I think the bigger and more important message is the one that you started with, that sometimes you just need to take away in order to move forward more efficiently, more quickly, and with the right solution.
So Faisal, from the initial goal of being a concert violinist.
Yeah, I tried to get back into the violin, When when would this have been? I guess, was it before or after?
When you came back from your trip to India.
No, not then. I think it was before. Oh, heck, it doesn't matter. I was in the business, whether it was before I was in France or after in France. My mind is foggy on it. Came back to Canada, was in the business, was single at the time, and I'm dating, but, not like creating a serious relationship just to have a girl by my side sort of thing. So a lot of time alone. I was like, well, how can I fill some of this time? Like, maybe I should get back into the violin. And so I went to my first lesson with my teacher, and she gave me some stuff to work on, come back onto the second, third lesson, and it just sounds like dead cats, right? Just like dead cats, going through their death throes. And it just broke my heart because I was really freaking good 20 years earlier as a kid. Like, I was exceptionally good, and now I sounded like dead cats. And she just, after a while of putting up with me, she just it's like, well, why is it that your progress is so slow? You told me that you loved the violin and you used to once upon a time be really good. And I was like, well, I got all this business travel and whatever. And she's like, well, you're going to have to take the violin with you and practice. That's the only way you're going to make the progress. You remember how much you used to play and practice when you were younger? I'm like, oh, come on, this is not going to work. I got my carry-on luggage and whatever, and I've got limitations. There's no way I'm packing a violin.
Which probably 20 years later, the plasticity of your brain is that much, maybe less, that
Exactly.
It's going to take you twice the amount of time.
Exactly, twice the amount of practice.
to be able to reacquire that skill at the same rate.
100%. And so I was like, you know what? Maybe that was just a chapter in my past. I'm okay with that. I can live with that. I have moved on and I'm happy. Don't need to trying to relive my 13-year-old self here.
Did you study engineering first or business first?
Engineering.
Okay.
Engineering undergrad, business.
So from
later.
going from the initial goal of being a concert violinist to studying engineering in Ontario, to studying business overseas in Paris, you're now basically a religious scholar.
Yeah, sure. What does our mutual friend Nick, what does he call me? An Islamic cleric who seeks inspiration from Vietnamese beachfront property. Something like that.
Okay,
Anyway,
well,
that'll make sense later on as we talk about it.
Making sure that we're simplifying, but being very specific.
Yeah.
That again kind of presents this idea of being so multifaceted, and the importance of filling our minds with something that is a big task, but that is also very motivating to us. You've shared with me that your dad would almost every night when he was not traveling take the time to teach you something related to the Quran. So how did this, or was this religious study always a mainstay in your life?
I would say religion, and specifically Islam, as you've noted, was sort of the foundational layer, the foundational element to a lot of what he was trying to teach. He wasn't just trying to teach what the religion had to say, but he was trying to teach us how to think, per se. And we can talk later about how he attempted to achieve that. But I think it worked. He turned me into a thinker, certainly. I don't know if he turned my older sister into much of a thinker. My younger sister's somewhat of a thinker, which is nice to see. But as tends to happen when you teach younger minds about religion, is that when they get the chance to explore something more interesting, perhaps more freedom oriented, they're probably going to do it. And so I still wouldn't call myself particularly religious. I'm very interested in what the religion has to teach, but I think the traditional sense of the word religious doesn't necessarily apply to me. I'm just very much of a thinker, and I think that there's a lot of truth in what is conveyed in the Quran, and so why think about lies when you can think about truth? I don't know. That's why it's become such a central part, but for me today. But once I left home at the age of 18 and went off to undergrad or whatever, and just ended up never living back at home again, in my parents' home again, I certainly wasn't, thinking about religion or picking up the Quran and reading it. It's like, that was my childhood, that was my upbringing, and now I'm going to go explore what it is to be my own person, myself. And it had nothing to do with religion. It only came back after I sold a business and ended up getting locked down through this whole COVID thing. You'll remember the example I gave of standing around milling about as a group of kids on the lawn of an apartment building. We use that as an example of contrarianism, but it's also an illustrative example for me of, you got to be freaking productive with every moment that you've been given. So the way I would answer that, one of those three questions, the middle question, what does it mean to be alive? For me, what it means to be alive is to be doing something with the minutes, the seconds, the minutes, the hours, the days, the weeks, the months that I exist, right? I can't just sit idly about. Like, I've sold my business, so I'm not doing business anymore. For whatever reason, they're telling us we got to stay home and can't go anywhere, and they've made, trying to go anywhere as a miserable experience. I'm not going to just sit around idly and flip on the Netflix or do whatever else that's non-productive. I'm going to think about something, because that's all they've left me to do, is to use my brain. And so that's how I ended up in this space and revisiting again the subject of religion. It wasn't strictly post-COVID. I would say I got a little shocked into revisiting religion when my dad passed away. And I think that's typical. Like what I did, I think most children who lose a parent would do, is think about that parent. And of course, so much of my memory of my dad was him teaching us as kids about the religion. And, he had a very liberal interpretation of the religion for himself. But you could still see the importance of that book. He read that book every single day. Even while he was traveling, he had like a smaller compact version that he could read from when he wanted to. So it was clearly important. So that's really what got me back to looking at it. But I didn't really start deeply thinking about it until this whole COVID thing started.
I really appreciate this tension between being such an analytical mind or character, let's say, that you are, being an engineer, being a businessman, and being able to, I don't think entertain is the right idea, but being interested by a particular book, right? A particular religious text, let's say. I would agree with you. I don't find you to be overly religious, but being such a student, and part of that was implemented by your dad of making this habit of studying the book and actually understanding in some ways the real world applications of how to think about these things was really important, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So he would sit you guys down and kind of help illustrate these examples of real world application of this book through your life, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, every night when he was home, we'd sit down as a family and say our prayers together. And then he'd say, not so fast, don't run off yet. Go grab the Quran from the bookshelf, sit down, and you're each going to read a passage. And, a passage is not too long. He wouldn't burden us too much. It took 10 minutes, whatever, to read it. And then after that, read the English translation, because Arabic isn't our mother tongue. I mean, Arabic is the language of Islam, but you get Muslims from all over the world, and my parents are from India. So I know how to read Arabic. I don't know what most of the words that I'm reading means, which is why I have to read the English. But a Quran is not a Quran without the original Arabic present. So at any rate, I read the Arabic. I would read me and my sister, we would read the English translation, and then he'd ask us questions about, well, what do you think that means? What do you think it's trying to describe? If it was trying to describe something about how to live or how to behave or this or that or whatever, he'd try and draw in some real life examples from us being kids and how we would treat our friends or treat our teacher, whatever the case might be. And so he just got us to think, got us into the habit of using our minds and thinking. But once we got a little bit older, probably around the age of 11, 12, maybe 10 even. Yeah, probably from the age of 10 even. He would, every Sunday, so he was an avid consumer of current affairs news. So he would be reading his newspaper all week long, but on Sunday, was his, I think he lived for Sunday mornings, because he'd get these news shows, they're not like nightly news, but there was commentary and analysis, and it was much like you and I who might listen to podcasts today. It was the podcast of his era, right? These experts would come in and give their opinions and insight and analysis on what was happening in the world of politics around the world. Washington Week in Review, Sunday morning by CBS, whatever those things are called, those shows were called. So he'd watch all of those, and he'd come fresh to us with a whole bunch of current affairs stuff, and he'd want to discuss it. And sometimes he'd even make us watch the shows with him. But let's talk about what we just heard. And then he would bring in religion as well, and because the Quran is not just about pray 5 times a day, fast during the month of Ramadan, Muhammad was your prophet, and here are some other prophetic stories. That's not what it is. It really is, how can you say, it's almost like a guidebook to life, right? Like, it talks about sound money. It talks about morality, obviously, and ethics. I mean, that's mostly what religion talks about. It talks about inheritance law.
How ironic.
Right, yeah. It talks about inheritance law. It talks about how to good economics. What is good economic practice? What is a bad behavior that would lead to a poor economy, and not a bad behavior, an unfavorable behavior, right? It's an obligation of Muslims to spend of the money that they earn, to spend of their wealth. Yeah, you got to save, but don't hoard. I mean, other people need to stand to make a profit as well, right? And that's not going to happen if you don't go out and spend your money. Don't be Scrooge McDuck, in other words, I guess, right? So it teaches all these different things. It teaches, it's a guidebook to human life, how you should run yourself and run your society and run your family, etc. And so because it's a guidebook to life, it was easy for a man who was as proficient as he was in the Quran, because he must have read it dozens of times over that book. For him to be able to then pose questions on us when he's talking about current affairs, to be able to compare it against what the book might teach in terms of that particular perspective.
For listeners that have maybe a real aversion to religion, I get that. I understand it. I promise this is going somewhere.
Yeah.
As I said, you're not as you mentioned, you're not overly religious per se. But
No, and I
this-
find overly religious people very off-putting.
But, and especially, I think there could be people that hear that your study of the Quran or the fact that you're a Muslim, maybe that's off-putting as well. Because I think, again, in Western society, we have this idea of what, somebody, if you hear the word Islam, what that means. So where do you think that difference between the different sects of Islam come in, and why we have such a negative connotation to this idea of Islam or the Muslim faith?
Well, I think we have a negative connotation first and foremostly because Muslims suck. I'm just going to lay it out there. I have a very low level of admiration for, speaking in broad blanket terms, the Muslim world today. There is a moment of reckoning that is very fast approaching for the Muslim world. And it is due penalty, I would say, for being so callous and careless about this gift that they've been given, that the Muslims have been given, which is this religion. I would say the more astute Muslims that I come across are those that are converting into the religion, or as for whatever reason they're calling it reverting to Islam, but whatever. I don't want to get into that. I don't even really understand what that means, but I would call it, non-Muslims who are converting to Islam are more articulate and intelligent about the beauty of what the religion has to teach than people who are born into the religion. So I'm talking about the Bangladeshis, the Indian Muslims, the Pakistanis, the Indonesians, the Saudis. Those people who are born into this religion are just ignoramuses. The Muslim world would not be in the state that it is today if these people really digested the book, the core book of the religion, the Quran, and understood what it teaches and lived by it properly. Which is the, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not ultimate. Which is the primary, when as a Westerner we think of the Muslim world and we think about who might be in the strongest leadership position, let's say, of the Muslim world, you would say Saudi Arabia, because that's where Mecca is. That's where 2 out of the 3 holiest Muslim sites are. It's in Saudi Arabia. When Muslims pray, they pray all orienting their bodies towards Mecca, right? So being here in the West, if we're facing towards Mecca, we're facing east. If you're in China and you're a Muslim and you're praying towards the West. So that's why, Saudi Arabia would be the logical, entity, that you would think it's like if a Vatican City existed for Islam as it does for Christianity, it would probably be Saudi Arabia somewhere, right? But I mean, those guys are the worst Muslims, the absolute most corrupt, despicable examples of Muslims. Just dogmatic. There's this, branch or sect of Islam. It's a Sunni sect called Wahhabism. And that's essentially what Saudi Arabian Islam is this Wahhabian, this dogmatic, ignorant, absolutely ignorant, and as it turns out, populated by very corrupt people. So anyway, long story short, the Muslim world sucks because Muslims suck, by and large. Can it change? Yes. Will it change? Prophesied to change. Was it prophesied to be this way? Actually, it kind of was. I have a hard time with wrapping my head around what the heck prophecy actually means, because I strongly, strongly believe in free will, but it's something I'm working through and regularly thinking about, like, what the heck does prophecy actually mean? But again, long story short, it was prophesied that, the Muslim world would get to this point where it was just so like degenerate that it would require a special individual to come along, this prophesied individual called the Imam al-Mahdi, who would reform, basically give a quick swift into the pants of the Muslim world to get it to reform and get its head straight, screw it on, recognize that, holy crap, this book actually has something to say and I haven't been living according to it at all whatsoever, quickly reforming itself in order to, do what Islam was intended to do, the reason it was put on earth. And so one might ask the question, no Muslim, even probably those who are converting into it, would be able to articulate this. But Islam was introduced by God to humans through the Ishmaeli side of the Abrahamic progeny. He had two sons, right? Isaac and Ishmael. So Ishmaeli side of Abrahamic progeny. It was revealed to act as the wingmen to Christianity. Nobody will tell you that because nobody gets it. It's in the book. It's there. You just got to read it and digest it and be humble about it. It's like, so the problem...
Everybody wants to be the chosen one.
Everybody wants to be the freaking chosen one. Like, we're the winners. In the end, you ask just a basic Muslim in Saudi or Bangladesh or Pakistan, it's like, so, why do you follow this religion? Well, because we're right. Our book contains all the truth. Our book contains the truth, but the book, in all the truth that it articulates, does not tell you that winner, winner, chicken dinner, the Muslims, rule the world in the end. The Quran, Islam preaches what I call, I don't know if other people call it, I haven't heard it anywhere else, Pax Christi, right? There's a reason that the Messiah in Islam is exactly the same as the Messiah in Christianity. It's Christ, Jesus Christ. And I hope I can remember it properly, because it was a brilliant way by some scholar of describing what Islam is. Islam is a revivification of Christianity in a very Jewy sort of way. That is what ought to be understood of Islam. Because, again, according to me and according to some other very astute scholars, it's all one faith. It might be three different religions with their own rites, rituals, rules, their own form of culture, but it is one single faith.
With the base being that Abrahamic root.
Exactly. So, it started with the Israelites. The Israelites then come from the other son of Abraham, the Isaac side. And prophet after prophet after prophet, and we were talking about how humanity seems to always go through cycles. We keep backtracking because we can't nail down this morality thing, because maybe it's just human nature. So that's why so many prophet after prophet after prophet. Finally, they get to Christ, and they still screw it up. And so half the Israelites, in a manner of speaking, half the Israelites go off to become Jews because they rejected Christ, and the other half go on to become Christians, and still they can't get it right. So the Jews just got it wrong anyways because they rejected Christ, and some really astute Jews are coming back to terms and realize, oh crap, we did get it wrong. That guy was the Messiah. There's a really interesting, he'd be an interesting guy to interview for this. But anyways, we can talk more about him later. He was nominated for a Nobel Prize in, was it physics or chemistry? James Tour. He's not too old. He should be accessible. He did a series of lectures at the University of Waterloo, which is my alma mater. And so that's how I tuned into that. That's how I became aware of it. And he now, lo and behold, he actually married a Muslim woman along the way at some point as well, because he's an academic, he's in the university environment, you get a lot of foreign students. So anyways, that's how he met his wife. But it's not because he met her and she's a Muslim Like, he's more of a thinker than she is, I think is the way he describes it, but he's come to realize, holy crap, we got it wrong. So there's a cohort, I think a very small cohort of Jews out there that are like, yeah, we are a Jesus Christ Jew. I don't know how that makes sense, but that's what they are. So yeah, we were talking about the inability to really grasp this idea of morality. So all these prophets come down, and finally God says, okay, I give up, man. I can't do it through these freaking Isaac progeny anymore, through the Israelites. Let me try this other branch from Abraham's offspring and generations that followed the Ishmaelites, the Arabs, in other words. And let's send them a prophet and get that prophet to then come to the Jews and explain that, listen, y'all got it wrong. The whole Christ thing was important and necessary. You know, these various Jewish practices that you participate in are important, you know, because like we do things in Islam that are, you know, kind of rhyme a lot with what the rites and rituals of Judaism. Not all of them, but some of them. They rhyme at best. They don't match. And so that's why this person, whichever scholar it was, said it, I think nailed it on the head. Islam is a revivification of Christianity in a very Jewy sort of way, or a very Israelite sort of way, in all fairness.
So again, to hopefully keep anybody interested that, you know, might want to turn this off, I myself, for a long time, had almost an allergy to anything religious. But when you and I started talking about this stuff, I've found it very interesting, and I've found myself trying to learn quite a bit more about this, even on my own time, away from conversations that you and I have had. And your particular field of study within Islam has been eschatology. Yeah. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but define for us what the word eschatology actually means.
So eschatology is really simple in what it means. It just means the study of endings. So I didn't always live in this house. I lived in another house prior to this, right? I could come up with the eschatology of my life at such and such address. It's just the study of the ending. Like, how did it all end? The ending of that chapter of my life, that era of my life. What made me choose to leave that house? What were the decision factors? What were the circumstances? Whatever. You could write a book of eschatology on that. It's just a study of endings. You know, pick an ending to any sort of era. You can write you can take an eschatological view of that era, what happened at the end. So, but more commonly, the term eschatology is a religious. It is a religious discussion. Let's put it that way. It's a religious field of study because all three of these Abrahamic religions, and I believe many Eastern religions as well, but all three Abrahamic religions teach that we do come to an end at some point. There is eventually a last day of judgment. There is an end to human existence on the planet, and what comes after, you know, there's different ideas out there. I have my own ideas myself. So that's why eschatology tends to be a religious topic, because religion says that, well, it does come to an end. Now, sometimes people will say eschatology, simplified, is a study of end times. The big mistake that I think people make when they hear that is when they hear the phrase end times, they think they're hearing the phrase end of time. Armageddon. Yeah, well, Armageddon is one of the... Okay, let's not introduce that because that might muddy the...
As most people think about Armageddon, right?
Right.
The end of time, you know, the end is near, the whole world blows up and everybody's dead.
Yeah, right. In the common colloquial use of the word Armageddon, exactly. So I say that's a mistake because it is not a discussion or study of the ending of the world. It's a study or discussion of the end of history. In other words, if it were a book, if human civilization, human existence were a book, it is the study of the transition from the second last chapter, the penultimate chapter, into the last chapter, the ultimate chapter. It's that transition in the last few pages of the second last chapter into the first few pages of the very last chapter. Why is that the end of history? Because that whole last chapter has already been written and shared with us and explained to us through the three religions. It's that period of time in human history when we get to find out, after having, again, pardon the language, fucked around for centuries, millennia, right? Because the last chapter is written, God has said that, Christ, the last chapter is all about the kingdom of Christ. Let's just leave it at that. So with that chapter having been written, and knowing that the entry into the era of Christ, the kingdom of Christ, is, the struggle session that humans have to go through is dictated, the degree of struggle is dictated by how deeply and badly we've chosen to fuck around with our free will up to that point. That is what eschatology really is about. It talks about, let's just call it that struggle session. The last few pages of the second last chapter and the first couple of pages of the very last chapter.
Almost that chasm that we have to go through to come out to.
Well, it turns out that it's a
as
chasm because we have fucked around a lot, as one would tend to with free will, I suppose.
And that's not, concentrated to one particular faith or one particular people. It's
all of humanity.
All of humanity as a whole.
Yep. You've already heard what I had to say about Muslims.
Mm-hmm. So this is a very complex discussion, and I think to try to come at it somewhat directly will be important.
Yeah.
So that we're able to kind of identify the biggest pieces
Yeah.
to understand about this topic.
Yeah.
So why don't we start by kind of delineating what the biggest clues are that we have entered end times, or the end of this penultimate chapter.
So I might just kind of reframe that a little bit. I know what you're getting at, and we will address it. But what I would like to say is that because the degree of the struggle session that we're going to go through is dictated by how deeply we've chosen to fart around with our free will.
To stray from teachings.
To stray from teachings, essentially, right? And the guidance and the morality and all that type of stuff that was gifted to us. Because we have chosen to deviate from it so badly, the struggle session, the more we've chosen to deviate from it, the deeper the struggle session will be. The biggest farting around that we're doing right now, I believe, this is the way I understand it, again, struggling with the concept of prophecy and what it might mean, the way I have come to appreciate it is the reason we're going into this struggle session, getting to the last few pages of the second last chapter here, is because we are engaged now in the deepest fuckery, the most extreme degree of fuckery that we've ever been engaged in. And what is that? It is taking what the scripture prophesies and teaches and usurping it for, not by everybody, by the group of people that are doing it, usurping prophecy, hijacking prophecy in order to synthesize what scripture teaches in a way that intends to deceive and dupe the rest of humanity, such that these usurpers and imposters may gain their dominance and control over the rest of humanity, something that's been their lifelong, not lifelong is not the word because it transcends a single human life. It's been millennia long perverse objective of saying, I'm going to be the king of the world and everybody else is going to end up serving me.
It's almost
oppressively.
A deliberate misinterpretation is the wrong word, but a deliberate interpretation, a deliberate
Manifestation.
self-serving
manifestation,
twisting all of these teachings around, flipping them on their head, thinking about the inverse, how to get around this rule in order to suit yourself for basically, as you said, this idea of controlling the rest of the world.
Yeah, and some people may say, well, that sounds really conspiratorial. Which empire in history hasn't sought to achieve as widespread dominance as they can? They all collapsed under the weight of their own success, right? They overextended themselves and then ended up collapsing. But it's not like they didn't try. The Romans, the British, the Ottomans, the Persians would have liked to have done it. The Greeks would have liked to have done it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something ridiculous about human nature. Not all humans, but certain humans choose to embark on just bigger is better. Go big or go home. And why not just try and take over everybody and tell everybody what's right or what's wrong? Let's look at the collapsing American empire, for goodness sakes. Same idea, right? So, call it conspiratorial if you want, but that just means you're ignoring reality and history and facts. You're just trying to comfort yourself to feel like such a thing couldn't exist today. Well, it is very alive and well, and this current iteration of it is extremely nefarious because it's taking the goodwill and the trusting nature of human beings who think that religious scripture is a source of purity and comfort, and we can at least, at a minimum, in a crisis of trust like we're going through today, trust what the book has to say, the books, Torah, Bible, Quran, trust what they have to say. But lo and behold, you've got these, ne'er-do-goods, I think is the word I'm looking for, these ne'er-do-goods who are choosing to take this scriptural teaching and twist it and transform it exactly as you're saying to serve their own ends. And then not just twist the scripture, but manifest what the scripture has to say. So if in the end, Islam and Christianity teach that we get to Pax Christi, well then if we're trying to dupe everybody, we kind of have to play that whole thing out. And as difficult as it is to imagine or believe that that's going on, I'm pretty good at pattern recognition. That's something that I was assessed by a professional once upon a time. And he came back and he said, you score often. We've never had a score this high on pattern recognition capability. So this happened when I was going through an assessment when I wanted to join the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves. There's another one of the things. It never happened, and I'll explain why it never ultimately happened, although I really wanted it to happen. But you have to go through all the psychological evaluations, and they came back and said, your pattern recognition's off the charts, dude. We don't have a single score in our history that's come this high.
We don't have a job for you.
We don't have. No, they told me that the job that we're going to put you in, the department we're going to put you in, is not what you've applied for, which was the paratrooping division or whatever at Moss Park. They're like, no, you're going to do, what was it called? Communications, basically. Like something tech related or whatnot. At any rate, so my pattern recognition skills are incredibly good. And I am a keen observer of everything around me constantly, to the chagrin of those who have to live with me. I'm observing every little detail. And when I see a pattern, I take that pattern and I ask myself, well, it only becomes a pattern, let's put it this way, it only becomes a pattern because I've seen it somewhere else. It's like, oh, I've seen a triangle before, I'm looking at another triangle here. I wonder why I'm seeing this triangle for a second time and now a third time, so to speak. So it's on the basis of recognizing these patterns that I firmly believe that this, human treachery is going on, the misapplication of our free will to to bad things.
So let's go back to this idea of what are some of the biggest clues that we've entered this end of an era.
Right. So I think for Muslims, the single biggest clue was and people are probably might switch off the video at this point because it's going to sound like, oh, he's an anti-Semite. No. But the biggest clue is that the Jews returned to the Holy Land, right? So that's something that's called out in Islam as, being your key point of recognition that you are in full-fledged end times. And I say that, to those who might react and say, well, that's just a very anti-Semitic view. My view is I personally feel deep sorrow for the Jewish people because in this grand exercise of deceiving and duping humanity, they were the first ones to be subject to the deception of this nefarious cabal of ne'er-do-goods who are seeking to hijack scripture to serve their own materialistic, let's just call it that, ends, right? So, and I'm not alone in seeing it that way. There is a sect, a group of Jews out there who would call themselves Torah Jews as opposed to Talmudic Jews. And they say the same thing. Like, they say that this Zionist project of the homeland of Israel, etc., taking us back to the Holy Land, goes against everything that we were told by God, that if we did this, that, and the other, by God's will, we would be banished from the Holy Land and we would never be allowed to return. So they take issue with the fact that this, homeland for the Jews has been created because they see it as being against God's will. And they're right. According to Islam, the only way the Jews would be able to come back to the Holy Land against the will of God, as it were, would be by the actions of what the Quran labels as this group called Gog Magog. So if that's the case, then Islam gives a clue as to who this group is, Gog Magog, because all we have to do is look at the facts of history and go, who was responsible, who facilitated, let's say, the exercise of recreating this Holy Land idea and returning the Jews to the Holy Land. So that gives us an idea of at least where the head of the snake of this Gog Magog might lie. So when I earlier have called them the ne'er-do-gooders or the cabal of nefarious people, whatever, I'm talking about what the Quran describes as Gog Magog. And this is not something that I think should just be, it's not a subject that should just be casually brushed aside, because the concept of Gog Magog is not an Islamic concept. It's an Abrahamic concept. It's discussed in Judaism and it's discussed in Christianity as well. And it becomes really fascinating once you start looking at the eschatologies of the three different religions and just see how the Gog Magog, because it's the same name. It's not even just, Islam calls it Gog Magog and Christianity calls it, yin yang, and Judaism calls it Willy Wonky, right? And somebody has misinterpreted and said, well, there's three things. It's no, all three religions call it Gog Magog.
And it's this, in some ways, this perverting influence and corrupting influence that is helping the fuck around chasm to get deeper.
In a sense, yeah, for sure. Exactly.
It's this influence that is straying from the original teachings, let's say.
Yeah, it is this, basically, the actions of this Gog Magog group that now are not just a small collection of people. It's like the Bible and the Quran, I don't know about the Torah, both say that Gog Magog multiply so innumerably, it's like trying to count the grains of sand on the beach. I mean, just imagine that exercise. That's like well nigh impossible, right? So it's kind of like this Gog Magog has proliferated across all of humanity, essentially. There are very few who are not part of Gog Magog. Well, if that's true, what the heck does that mean? Because I'm not a card-carrying member of Gog Magog, neither are you. So what does this actually mean? So I understand that, therefore, to mean because these guys appear to be, the patterns that I've recognized show that these guys are trying to usurp scripture in order to synthesize, manifest Pax Judaica, that Gog Magog are all those people across the entire globe who wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, are spending of their personal self, their energy, their wealth, their mind, whatever, their intellect, I should say, spending of that to advance the project towards the establishment of Pax Judaica. Okay, like I said, I never considered myself a card-carrying member of Gog Magog, but when I understand that that is probably how we must think about Gog Magog, because if they've truly multiplied, how could they have multiplied, right? I certainly would have heard about it. I would have come across some recruiting session, but it doesn't work that way. This Gog Magog system, the system that they've created, is itself what pulls in new membership, let's say, into its ranks. And I was, for a period of time, almost certainly would have qualified as a member of Gog Magog. When I was working in that bank in London, working to advance and perfect and whatever the monetary system, the system of modern economics, debt finance and all that type of stuff, I was contributing in my very tiny, minor little way to the exercise, the project of advancing towards Pax Judaica.
Mm-hmm. So the idea of not prophecy, but prophets comes up quite a bit in this framework as well. Mm-hmm. So again, we need to hopefully stay at a high level with this stuff, because there are a million weeds to explore within this conversation.
Yeah.
But how do you see this current manifestation, let's say, of how these different sects would see a prophet coming to light to save everybody in a way?
Right. So, if we talk about Judaism, their Messiah, they believe that their Messiah has not come yet. So the ultimate chapter, so according to Jews, though, because they rejected Christ, they don't believe in Pax Christi, they believe in Pax Judaica. So their eschatology teaches that Pax Judaica emerges only once their Messiah comes. They're coincident. It's the Messiah arrives, the world understands and finally accepts that Judaism is the right religion, and the kingdom of Judaism encompasses all of humanity across the globe. So there's a Messiah figure. Christianity and Islam teach that the final chapter, the end of history, is when Pax Christi is established. And therefore, expect the second coming of Christ, right? But be forewarned that whoever shows up first and calls himself the Messiah is actually the Antichrist, as per Christian vocabulary. And in Islam, we prefer to refer to him as the false Messiah, not the Antichrist. And I choose to use the terminology false Messiah, not because I'm a Muslim, but because I think it's more accurate and more descriptive. Because Antichrist sounds opposite Christ. In our minds, the way we use the word anti, it sounds like opposite of Christ. And so what is Christ? We know how Christ is described: loving, magnanimous, just, etc. So we imagine the Antichrist to be exactly the opposite: unjust, unloving, blah, 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 blah.
Basically the devil.
Yeah, kind of like the devil's henchman, right? But what Christianity, true scholars of Christianity do actually understand is that the Antichrist will be an imposter of Christ and do all the things that you might expect out of Christ, and therefore be fooled into believing that the Antichrist is actually Christ. But yet they still call him the Antichrist. Islam, in calling him the false Messiah, is more inducive to getting one to appreciate and understand that whoever this figure that emerges is actually just acting as an imposter of Christ, a false Messiah. So if Christianity and Islam teach us to beware of the first guy that shows up calling himself the Messiah because he'll be the false Messiah, and you have the Jews who have said, well, we rejected Christ and he was certainly no Messiah, our Messiah has yet to come, well then, it doesn't take too much logical deduction to maybe figure out that whoever the Jews proclaim as their Messiah might actually be what was forewarned as the false Messiah, right? Okay. So how do you pull off this psyop, this manipulation, this deception, if you're Gog Magog, right? Well, because Islam teaches that you have to use your mind, to your word, ruthlessly. You have to exercise your mind ruthlessly. The Quran itself says this is a book for the thinking. So think. And pay attention. And one of the things that it tries to enforce in terms of thinking is ruthless levels of application of logic. So in doing this and recognizing the pattern that this, deception is taking place, how could they pull it off successfully? So for me, and it starts to get a little confusing and complex. You almost need a whiteboard to map it out. But the only way to get Christians and Muslims to agree that he who proclaims himself, in brackets, falsely, to be the Messiah, is if they believe, if these Christians and Muslims believe, are made to believe, that they indeed have actually witnessed the false Messiah already come and go, right? If you can get these 4 billion human beings on planet Earth, 2 billion Muslims and 2 billion Christians, to believe that, oh yeah, obviously that dude was the false Messiah. Thank God he's gone, and thank God we didn't fall for him. My God, we're good Muslims and Christians. We never fell for the deception that we were forewarned about. Okay, now
we're
whoever
ready.
comes by and tells us he's the real Messiah, probably the real Messiah, can't wait, it's, the end times, everything's going to be good, it's going to be super peaceful and prosperous and lovey and dovey and all that great stuff. That's the deception that's at play. Because, well, let me not further complicate it. I don't want to complicate it now. I think I've done a decent enough job of articulating it in a relatively clear way.
So who is that false Messiah then? In this current context, in this current geopolitical state? Because we're not just, the whole purpose of this conversation is not to just leave it abstract.
Right.
Right?
Sure. So you asked the question, so who is that figure? Who is the false Messiah?
As you see it.
As I see it. So as I see it, the false Messiah as it is taught to Christians and Muslims has not yet emerged. I believe what's going on right now is that part of the psychological operation, the deception, that gets us to believe that the false Messiah has come and is about to go, so to speak. So who is that? And I call that character, just to start making some distinction when we speak or write, I call that character the decoy false messiah. So in my analysis, there are three characters. This decoy false messiah, in order to dupe Christians and Muslims. The eventual actual false messiah, he who will falsely claim to be Christ, and who is the Jewish messiah.
Or the one to dupe the Jewish people?
Well, there will be duping of Jewish people as well, and that's what I just tried to stay away from because I didn't want to complicate it too much. So there's three characters. So the way the religious texts teach it is there's the false messiah and then the messiah, Christ. What I'm saying is the only way the synthesis of this deception can succeed is if there's three characters: a decoy of the false messiah, then the false messiah that they hope everybody will fall for, but then the actual messiah, and who he is we know, Jesus Christ. When he comes is not up to us. That is strictly up to God, right? So we are dealing with a decoy false messiah and a false messiah that Gog Magog are trying to get us to believe. Let me actually use my figures here. We are dealing with a decoy false messiah and a false messiah that Gog Magog in their deception are trying to get us to believe are the false messiah, actual messiah, and trying to, pull off a deception before, or if ever, because they certainly don't believe in Christ, if ever this guy were to show up. Does that make sense? Does using the fingers help? Okay. So who is this character then, this decoy? I believe it's Trump. Why do I believe it's Trump? Because the pattern recognition makes me see it as being Trump. Just the way his first presidency, his stolen presidency, and now his second presidency, just the way it's played out is very similar to the story of Christ. He's had his second coming, and that second coming is as a result of his ability to overcome and transcend all of the efforts to destroy him, to figuratively, I should say, crucify him through lawfare, bullets, discrediting of his character, etc., 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 poisoning, impeachment, poisoning of the public opinion, basically, on the decency of the man. I will point out that I do believe Trump has good intentions. I do believe he does love his country, and I do believe he would like to fulfill his mantra of making America great again, which I don't see a problem with. I would like it if our leaders would make Canada great again. I'm sure the French would love it if their leaders would make France great again, et cetera, et cetera. I think it is the duty and the responsibility and the role of a leader of a nation to make that country great, or keep that country great if it's already great. So there's nothing wrong with that. You're going to have to get past it if you want to listen to me speak on the matter. So I point this out about Trump, that I think he's genuinely sincere about his intentions, because I think he's an unwitting character in this whole thing. I think he's just someone who's been he was recognized, identified as being a useful, I don't want to call him an idiot, because I don't think he's that stupid. I mean, he says some things that makes me wonder sometimes, but I don't think he's an idiot.
A useful pawn, maybe.
A useful pawn, let's say, yeah. Just a useful, unwitting character in this whole thing. His passion for his country is an element of that usefulness that he is, right? And why is he so easily manipulated then? Because he's got a fundamental character flaw, unfortunately. And I've seen it in other people as well, in my own life. Like, I've seen individuals like this who are so vainglorious, so egotistical, so self-absorbed that all you have to do is, sprinkle a few compliments on them and they turn into putty in your hands and they do what you want them to do. You just tell them that they're the prettiest or the most handsome or the richest or the most intelligent or whatever, the most something good. And they just start to become soft putty in your hands and you can do with them what you will. And I think that's what's happened to Trump over the course of his life. This is not just something that started in 2016 or whatever. I think they identified the man a long time ago as being useful. And I think they run a lot of different characters in parallel as they try and synthesize this false destiny. They're just like, well, who are we going to use? Well, let's just keep our eye out. Let's keep the recruitment cycle going. Let's just figure out who we're ultimately going to assign and to cast into these key roles. And so Trump being that figure, he won the 2016 presidency. He devastated his opponent. Everybody thought she was going to win, Hillary Clinton. He won. He was surprised he freaking won. Let's be honest about it. Just look at his reaction to being announced the winner. And he's like, well, I guess I'm president. He served his presidency. They tried to tear him down like they tried to tear down Christ because he was trying to drain the swamp, as he called it, much like Christ was there to drain the swamp of the Israelite community. He went in and into the temple and dealt with the bankers, the money changers, as it were, whatever. So, he emerged as this reformer, right? Trump emerged as this reformer. Trump gets persecuted and, figuratively speaking, crucified in the minds of public opinion. He goes away, he disappears for a period of time, like Christ after crucifixion has disappeared from earth for a period of time, but he's prophesied and promised, lo and behold, to return to us one day. And now this figure in the form of Trump as a decoy false Messiah has returned to us, overcoming all of the persecution and everything triumphantly to win the election in 2024. And so when I was looking at it, I had my epiphany. The pieces sort of fell into place in my head on all of this a little over a year ago, January 2024. I was on a long vacation with my wife. We were in a warmer climate in Vietnam, and that's why Nick says, you sound like a Muslim cleric who's, what did he say? Gaining epiphanies or whatever, religious epiphanies, while sitting on Vietnamese beachfront property. So the reason he says that is because I was on the beach.
Was quite literally that.
Quite literally that. I was sitting on a beach waiting for my wife to get ready so we could go for dinner. And as I was sitting there, just this light bulb went off in my head. I had the aha moment. Pieces fall into place. Lo and behold, I start formulating this thesis now. And this thesis, when I put out, was well before the US elections. I finally put it down in writing because Alex, our mutual friend again, Alex Craner, he kept prodding me, you got to write a book, you got to write a book. And I'm like reluctant to write a book because A, we're right in the middle of it. Why am I going to write a book about something that's actually going on, to my mind? But I did take the time to just at least type out the thesis in one fell swoop. So that came out like middle or late June of 2024. And I was telling people, this whole subject of who's going to win the election, how are they going to steal it from Trump or whatever, I said it's a moot point. Don't waste your time. Go home, enjoy, have a good summer, come back on election day. Trump is going to win. Trump is ordained to win. Why ordained? Because they got to advance this gambit, this deception, and he's the chosen guy. It's clear as day to me. Like the patterns are right there. He's going to win, but he's going to win in a fashion that appears to us, at minimum appears to us, if not is actually against all odds. That he has to be painted as a person who emerges triumphant despite every effort to have him lose, to make him lose. And so I said, it's all going to be noise and drama and really good reality TV, so to speak, but the guy's going to win. Ignore the noise, enjoy yourself, don't stress about it. Because a lot of people wanted him to win, but were afraid he wasn't going to win, right?
And just to clarify, you typed this all out on your Twitter feed.
That's right, yeah. It's available as item number 6 in my pinned tweet. I call it my GUT, my GUT, the grand unifying theory. And we don't have to explore why it's called a grand unifying theory, because it might add a little bit of noise to the conversation. But I see Trump as being that figure who's being cast in our minds as being certainly a savior figure, and possibly, maybe, perhaps a messianic savior. Is he maybe Jesus come back? I mean, there's a lot of people out there speculating, writing, generally coming from religious circles, but who are speculating that maybe this guy is actually the promised return of the Messiah. And that is exactly what they want us to think. Because the only way you get, okay, let me back that up. Because the false Messiah, as I described, is an imposter of Christ, does all the things you would expect out of Christ, because the false Messiah is that.
Has all the power and showmanship and wow of the second coming.
Of the second coming, the Messiah. If that is to be true of the false Messiah, then the decoy to the false Messiah has to be the same, right? And so that's why I say that's why I narrate this observation of mine of the pattern of Trump's first presidency, his stolen presidency, and his triumphant return. After predicting and forecasting correctly that he would win that election, it was ordained, I then went on to say that between election and inauguration day, we may see some further shenanigans that really reinforce to us his ability to overcome all odds and return to the Oval Office in the White House. That didn't 100% play out the way I imagined, but it did play out. There were a lot of shenanigans where it appeared that they were trying to sabotage his presidency, amping up illegally in many respects the war in Ukraine, doing things that just didn't make sense, wasn't in the best interest of Ukraine, certainly wasn't in the best interest of the West, and maybe you can think of other examples that they were undertaking to sabotage his presidency. Shenanigans, nonetheless, and odds pitted against the incoming president, playing out in a way not exactly as I had anticipated, but nonetheless of noteworthy events had taken place. So I kind of got that right.
Pardoning a bunch of people going into the very end of Biden's presidency.
Yeah.
Just stacking the cards against Trump's favor.
Right, exactly. So, I kind of got that right. I'll give myself, 50-50 score on that one.
It is possible, too,
correct.
though, that there could have been things that just weren't reported that did happen, right? Because
possibly,
they don't necessarily want to muddy the waters with that, with what's actually happening.
Maybe, but I would, if I understood what your comment was correctly, I would say that if the public's not hearing about it, it's not actually happening, because it's really about shaping the public impression, the public opinion.
Veneer.
Sorry?
The public veneer. It's about shaping that persona of this mountain that he has overcome.
That's right. And so it has to be made public, otherwise you can't shape the public opinion.
You keep saying they, and in many of these conversations that I've had, I try to pin down who they is. They are against Trump. They are doing this. I think, very much so you mean by they Gog Magog. Yeah. But who can we kind of point to, obviously somewhat from, you can't, let's say, identify them directly, but who are some of the entities, let's say, that
something more definitive that we can relate to?
Not even necessarily definitive, but
okay.
who is playing the role in modern times of Gog Magog, these these antithetical almost characters to the positive conclusion to this story?
Well, if you look at who the ultimate snake, which people form the ultimate head of the snake, I can't comment on, but because I don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows, except they themselves. If you look at the single greatest tool of Gog Magog in order to advance this whole deception and this agenda and this system, I would say Gog Magog are largely the banking system, the modern, I wouldn't even call it modern Western, it's the modern banking system. And the modern goes back quite a ways, by the way. Look up the date of the founding of the Bank of England. I mean, it even predates that, but of this whole era of Pax Britannica leading to Pax Americana, leading to Pax Judaica, we have to go back to the founding of the Bank of England at the earliest, I'd say, or the Glorious Revolution, whatever that date is, late 1500s, 1600s-ish, that time frame. That has been their single greatest tool of expansion and oppression and domination and moving towards the project of manifesting synthetically Pax Judaica, right? So anybody affiliated with the modern banking system and all those entities or parties that prosper and benefit from the machinations of the modern monetary system and banking system and economic system. So, you throw that out onto the table, you go, okay, well, that then ends up including all of these apparently corrupt and immoral Western governments, France, Germany, Canada, the ex-Biden, the now gone Biden administration. There's probably others out there. Kaya Kallas, where is she from? Estonia. All these guys, all these characters that we just can't stand to look at or to listen to. The EU, all of that, Brussels, basically. But I think Gog Magog extends even beyond that because this casts a very, very, very broad net these days to say all those affiliated with the modern banking system / modern monetary system. There is no such thing as, I don't know if I'm saying it the right way or the most clear way, but there's no such thing as a non-fiat currency anymore, right? In other words, all currencies are fiat currencies today. That wasn't the case for the very longest time, but once that finally became the case, this whole fiat monetary system has proven to be the single greatest engine of locomotion to move this juggernaut of a project of creating Pax Judaica forward. These last 50 years have been very, very fruitful for Gog Magog in getting towards the final ultimate goal of Pax Judaica. So, I say Pax Judaica, Pax Judaica, Pax Judaica. What do I mean? I mean the kingdom, the Jewish kingdom that they're trying to create, but they would like us to believe is Pax Christi. Again, that deception of, that shell game of, well, who's the real false Messiah? Did I just witness a decoy or did I witness the actual false Messiah? And, well, if I did witness the false Messiah come and go, then I guess the next guy is the actual Messiah. That's the shell game that's going on in order to create Pax Judaica, but get us to believe it's Pax Christi.
So let's talk a little bit about in some ways, the framework or the structure, the timeline, maybe is a better way to describe it, of what this end time looks like. When you talk about what the future looks like, you're very hopeful, optimistic, enthusiastic about what is coming.
Yeah.
But what happens between 2025 and
that golden era?
That literally golden era where everybody can prosper, everybody can be happy. It does sound, and maybe define what that golden era is.
Yeah. So, well, I think the golden era part is really easy to elucidate.
Okay, so let's
explain.
start there. What is the golden era?
Pax Christi.
Okay,
But the real Pax Christi, the actual Pax Christi.
which means what?
Which means that, well, because I believe in the Holy Book, it means that Christ finally does return, because we really are amplified up the human fuckery going on. And the only thing that's going to get us past that amount of human fuckery is, as promised, if you fuck around in this space, we're sending, we meaning the royal we, God speaking to us, we're sending God, Christ back, and he's going to open up a can of whoop ass on humanity and set you all straight. And, you know, and then it's just going to be his kingdom, the golden era, prosperity, as promised, prosperity, peace, you know, love to your fellow man, all that type of good stuff. But, you know, while it all sounds like a fairy tale and, you know, a nice ending to a good book, we still exist as human beings, and human beings have free will. And that free will is not going to get taken away. Nowhere does it describe this in the holy books that you lose your free will when Christ returns. You basically all turn into angels, because Islam teaches angels are one of God's creations that don't have free will. They can only do God's will, do good. None of the Abrahamic religions teach that when your Messiah comes, you lose your free will. So if our free will still exists, and we remain created in the image of God, meaning having that creative spirit, the only of God's creations who are able to take an invisible nothing and turn it into something, right? It might sound blasphemous to say that, but let me explain myself. Show me an idea. I don't mean show me the product of an idea. Show me the idea. You can't show me the idea. Like, what is an idea? Is it something that's preloaded into our brains that we're all born with, or is it something that's being radio waved to our heads from outer space? What the heck? Who knows what an idea is? But it is an idea that creates, so we're videotaping this thing, all this gadgetry, right? It's the idea that creates the first wheel that then, you know, becomes ox carts that become cars. It's the idea that humans can fly. When we observe birds, how do we make it happen? Well, we figured out how to do that. There's planes everywhere. Those invisible ideas turned into physical things. That's exactly what God did. God from nothing created the universe, is what we're taught. So we're created in the image of God. We don't lose our free will. Christ is here. And if Christ is going to bring about all of these wonderful things, right, introduce a wonderful, peaceful, prosperous environment, and we still exist, well, there's a whole heck of a lot of great things that we can do. And to my mind, I believe that Pax Christi is a golden era, not just because of what Christ brings, but because of what we are able to accomplish as we apply ourselves in a manner that maximizes the fulfillment of our individual and collective potentials, where we really undertake to exercise and extract the most out of what I called at the beginning of this conversation, the meaning of life, which is to fulfill our potential. So that's the golden era that I see coming. Pax Christi, basically, where humans do tremendously marvelous things. I also will say that, you know, you heard me say that end times is the last few pages of the penultimate chapter and the first couple of pages of the ultimate chapter. Let's just, for illustrative purposes, say in total we're talking about 100 pages here is end times. Where are we in end times today? We are on like page 98 or 99. End times has actually been going on for hundreds of years right now. And if one chooses to believe the way Islam illustrates it, explains it, it's been going on for 1400-ish years. Excuse me, got hiccups. 1400-ish years. And so because we are in the very late stages of end times, page 90, 97, 98, 99 out of 100 pages, mere seconds from midnight, if you will, things are going to progress very, very quickly from here. There's not a lot left to read in all of this. And so by my estimate and guesstimate, and which is really funny because funny is not the right word, really fascinating because it resonates and rhymes with what some other analysts, non-religious entirely, have to say based on their models of understanding the world and cycle analysis and whatnot. My timing kind of lines up with their timing. I say we're all through and done with all of this crap. In other words, we will have crossed through the chasm of end times, late stage end times, and emerged out to the other side within 10 years. Not within, I should say in 10 years. So call it 2035, mid 2030s to finally get to the other side of this thing. Don't ask me on what day Christ is coming. I don't know. Nobody knows. People might say that they know, but I don't think anybody knows. But what I will say is I think that the chapter of the Decoy, false messiah, has to play out relatively quickly now, within the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, he's only got a 4-year presidential term, so it's going to happen in 2 to 3 years. I think other things like his ordained failure has to happen. Why ordained failure? Because the only way we perceive him as a false messiah, decoy as he is, the only way we perceive him as a false messiah is if we first imagine that maybe he's our messiah. You know, the one thing we didn't talk about was one of my other predictions, which appears to be coming true as well, is that as soon as he gets into the Oval Office, he starts whacking out a whole bunch of wow factor, I call them accomplishments, things that make us go, holy freaking crap, he really is a savior. I really kind of wonder.
We kind of made that point earlier.
Yeah. So, you know, but once we get it into our heads that maybe, just maybe, he's the Messiah, he's got to fail. So that's why I say, sadly, unfortunately, there is an ordained failure, preordained, I guess is the word, failure in his future. I don't know what the mode of failure is. I can guess, I can make some educated guesses, but I'm not a prophet. I'm just someone who's trying to apply logical deduction here. There is an ordained failure. That ordained failure has to happen in the course of us thinking that maybe he's the Messiah. And then such failure combined with such misconception is what, you know, yields us to believe we've witnessed the coming and the going of the false Messiah, somebody who we thought was going to save us, but didn't, failed, because that is what Scripture says. The false Messiah is going to come. He's going to pretend to be the real Messiah, but he fails. And he fails at the hands of the real Messiah. At least that's the way Islam teaches it. So I think things are going to go fairly quickly. It's about 10 years, basically, because once he fails, you know, the Great War has to happen. You know, maybe on another discussion we can unpack some of that stuff, but, you know, the Great War has to happen. The actual false Messiah has to come about, and then he has to have his failure. But all of this stuff doesn't take long, doesn't span a lot of time if you read Scripture. And so, thankfully, although it feels like a long time, 10 years also does pass fairly quickly. So while I was waiting for us to start this conversation today, I was just musing to myself that, holy crap, since I first sold my business, like I sold it in 2 tranches, since 2018, it's almost 7 years. I'm getting close to 7 years. I can't believe that happened 7 years ago. I got to pinch myself. So,
well, even realizing that COVID was almost started 5 years ago is insane to think about.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, while 10 years might sound like a lot because we've all lived through 10 years and we know how much can change in 10 years, yes, a lot is going to change in these coming 10 years. But days, weeks, and months and years go by in the blink of an eye these days. That also ties into some eschatological stuff. Again, let's not bog down this first conversation with too much noise. There's an infinite amount it seems to talk about, but these 10 years are going to come and go very, very quickly. Those of us who think we're still young and vivacious people will find ourselves maybe creaky and older in 10 years because the human body will continue to age. But like what I like to tell people, particularly the younger people that, I find engaging, energetic, intelligent, who are worthy of mentoring, I like to tell them, well, if you're 20 years or younger, and that's why I focus on 20 years and younger kids, I tell them that you're in the sweet spot. Why are you in the sweet spot? By and large, you probably haven't accumulated a lot of wealth. So all of this crappy era that we're going to go through, you don't stand to lose much, really. But what you need to do is make sure you get across to the other side. So you got to hold on to your physical health. You got to work on your physical health, your mental health, your intellect. And I would strongly suggest to everybody, if you can find it within you, work on your spiritual health as well. And then there's financial health and this and that. But for these young kids, they don't have wealth accumulated at this point. So the whole financial aspect, they don't need to stress about that too much. And I also remind them and tell them, don't get bogged down or anxious or, depressed over all of this stuff that the adults around you, the older people around you, are going to get anxious and depressed and upset. Sadly, probably even suicidal over. Don't let that infect you. Let them deal with it. It's their lot in life. Guys like me, we're going to have to work through it. But the good ones amongst us, older people, are going to do what we can to make sure that younger generation makes it across the chasm. And so why is it 20 years and younger that I choose as the defining age? Because when you get to your 30s, when you hit your 30s, for most people, that's the start of the wealth accumulation phase of your life. So if this thing is going to last another 10 years, the most awesome place to be would be a 30-year-old on day one of Pax Christi, so to speak, right? Yeah. Right? If you were to optimize the equation, you're 30 at the time of Pax Christi. Well, that means you're 20 today. And if you're 20 years or younger, you're going to be accumulating your wealth during the golden era of human history, on the arc of the trajectory of the human story. You're going to be participating in the coolest freaking part, and I'm almost jealous of these kids, right? But I've been successful. I've accomplished a lot. What I see my role as and my contribution back as is, well, having conversations like this, getting people to think, sharing the patterns that I see, sharing the product of my logical deduction, and giving of myself back to these kids who might benefit from such sort of pep talk, let's call it. Giving them the pep talk and maybe some guidance.
Some sort of guidance.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well, that's one thing that I also aspire to do is, this is a complicated discussion.
Yeah.
And
that's the whole point of this new project, really, isn't it?
Totally. But that's exactly what I'm saying is it's complicated, but reach for it.
Yeah.
Many times I've listened to podcasts about quantum physics, for example. That is way over my head.
Yeah.
Way complicated discussions. And I'll listen to it 4 or 5 times just to try to understand a little bit about it. A, because it interests me, and B, because I love reaching for that challenge of trying to grasp something that I had no understanding of before that. And this is a perfect example of a discussion like that. Take that challenge on. Mm-hmm. However that looks to you, keep taking those challenges on, because that is what keeps you energized, it keeps you interested, and it keeps you maybe working towards
competence. Wink, wink. Yeah.
As we go through this shitty period, it's gonna suck.
Yeah.
But that's actually like a perfect way to put it. And if there's ever a task, like I remember my dad made me cut down this tree, and it was just the least enjoyable possible task. Cutting down this tree, picking up, it was gigantic.
Okay.
Gigantic.
Okay.
I almost died trying to cut the branches out of this thing and fall it with no proper equipment.
Were you up the tree?
Oh yeah.
Taking down the limbs with a
in skate shoes.
In what shoes? Skate shoes?
Skateboard shoes.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Like Converse or something?
Yeah, whatever. That's not the important part. The important part is the task sucked ass.
Yeah.
And I didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
But you know what? At the end of the day, I thought, there is an end to this suffering. There is an end to this task. At some point, I'm going to be back riding my bike. I'm going to be back in the sun. I'm going to be back doing something
Yeah, I
that
can remember
love to
things
do.
like that. I never cut down a tree, but I can remember things that my dad would, or my mom even would make me do, and it's like, this sucks. I can't wait to be done.
That's important, to have that
totally.
perspective, to sit back and say,
Yeah.
fuck, this is not something I want to do.
Yeah. And
Sit back,
a lot of
remember, there's an end to it. Every chapter, no matter how good nor how bad, has an end to it.
Yeah, and all of life, it's just a process. You know, the end will come when the end comes. But enjoy the process, you know, or enjoy the process is a little silly way of saying it, trite way of saying it, because, you know, you're talking about being miserable through the process of cutting down the tree. Appreciate the fact that as crappy as the process or as enjoyable as the process is, you want to come out of it feeling like you've learned something from it, or it's improved you in some sort of way, or it had a meaning that maybe you're not able to extract today, but at some point down the road, you'll be able to extract the meaning of it for yourself. Because I can think of many crappy situations I've gone, like the whole period of my dad passing away, taking over this business. The worst year of my life, even though it's the year that I got married, so it's all happened in the same year. Coincidentally, was 2008, and now I look back on it. You know, all through it, it was just like you up on the tree. I really do not. I wish something were to. I wish I didn't come back to Canada. I wish I'd taken the banking. I wish I'd stayed in Europe. I wish I could be a European playboy. Blah 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 blah. All that crap going through my head. And now, looking back, I would have had it no other way. My life could not have turned out better than if I had managed to somehow avoid that hellish year.
Well,
with all the hellish incidents that happened along the way.
Even as dumb as it is, I was able to get through cutting down that tree and packing it all up and taking it to the waste station and all this stuff, so that I could use it on a podcast 10 years later.
There you go.
Example.
There's the meaning of that.
That's the only good thing.
You guys didn't even use it for firewood, where you could enjoy the warmth from it?
It wasn't where we lived. It was at a rental.
Oh.
And it was just cleanup day of this tree that makes a constant mess.
Oh yeah, messy trees suck.
Yeah.
We had a tree like that in a previous house.
Faisal, I think this is a great place to kind of put a pin in this conversation.
Sure.
I really, really appreciate your generosity, number one, the generosity with your time, with your knowledge, all of this. I think you and I share a deep passion to try to help mentor, to try to help educate people, to always do our best. You know, we have certain values like that we're very aligned on, and I very much appreciate that about you.
Yeah.
And is there anything else that you'd like to kind of leave our listeners with to consider or to keep in mind after this conversation?
I don't know, I think I captured it all. I'd suggest people, you know, reflect on what I had to say about the way I try and explain it to the young people, the 20-year-olds and younger. But, you know, if you're 30 or younger, or you're 40 or younger and you're listening to this, yeah, I mean, you stand to lose some stuff, but you've also got some time to get yourself, you know, at least somewhat prepared for the deepest, darkest parts of what are yet to come. Just don't be complacent. Find out what makes sense for you and do something about it, while at the same time maintaining the sense of excitement and optimism for where we're going into. It's very easy to get neurotic and bogged down about it. In fact, you know, when late last night, we kind of exchanged a couple of text messages with our mutual friend again, Nick. And Nick was explaining something about he had dinner with a friend. He's out on the west of Canada right now. He had a dinner with a friend, and the friend was explaining how dire it is and this and that and the other. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel as well right now. It's really dire. But we went out for dinner, you and I, with our other mutual friend, Jaime. I asked the question at the dinner table. It's like, well, so how do you feel about all this crap that's happening in terms of Canadian politics, and that we might not get the hoped for change in leadership, whatever. And he's like, what the heck do you care, man? You already set yourself up. You're prepared for it.
Mm-hmm. You're ready to surf that wave.
You're ready to surf that wave. Of course it was going to be shitty. You knew it was going to be shitty. That's why you got prepared. Get your head out of your butt. Enjoy the fact that you've prepared for it. And when that wave hits, don't swallow all the water and drown yourself. Just freaking surf it and enjoy the surf ride. So yeah, it's going to be super crappy, but it's going to be a heck of a ride. And if you do the right things, you get yourself a surfboard, you'll be able to surf it. And the beach is golden. When it washes you up onto the beach, it's a golden beach. It's going to be pretty spectacular. So that would be my parting thought. And the very last thing I'd say, I don't know if we talked about it in this conversation or if it was an earlier conversation, but in my opinion, there's no such thing as an unselfish act. So while you're grateful that I'm here sharing my time with you, there's something in it for me as well. This is not a selfless act. For me, it's an opportunity to share the ideas with you, with the listening audience, but also to explore out loud the ideas for me. Like it helps advance the thinking as well. Like you can't just always be up in your head and thinking through ideas. Sometimes you need to hear yourself speak it and see how it comes out. So it's as good for me as it is for you.
Excellent. And for those that want to read your gut, that's all available on your Twitter feed?
Yeah, pin tweet, scroll down until you get to item 6, and that's a 10-part thread. So you need about 25 to 30 minutes to read through it. And I would suggest finding a full 25 to 30 minutes, because reading it in bits and parts might not be as good as reading it once through. And you'll probably need to read it a couple
times. And
times.
what's your Twitter handle?
Oh yeah, it's at Buna Capital, but I can't. Is there a period in it? Let me just check real quick before I spout my mouth off here. No, it's all one word. So Buna Capital, that's B like Bob, U, N for Nancy, A for Apple, capital like money or capital letter, all one word. Buna Capital is my Twitter handle. So that's where you'll find me. Ask me questions too. I'm happy to take the time and try and explain my thoughts.
Excellent. Faisal, thank you again so much.
And you.